Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping quietly into a world of flickering gas lamps, cold corridors, and creaking staircases, the shadowed heart of the Victorian home. A time when houses didn't just shelter people, they spoke to them. Not in words, but in sighs, in groans, in the faint tapping of unseen hands against the walls. So before you settle in, take a second to like the video and subscribe. It really helps these calm journeys find their way to more sleepy historians like you. And as always, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you right now. It's always strangely comforting to know that somewhere, across oceans and time zones, we're all drifting together through history's quiet corners. Now, dim the lights. Maybe light a candle if you have one, or just listen to the soft hum of your fan, the creak of your own walls. Because tonight's story begins in a time when people truly believed that their homes could listen back. Let's settle in, breathe slow, and begin our descent into the still, gaslit world of the 19th century. A time when Victorian houses spoke with ghostly voices. It begins, as most quiet stories do, in the still air of an ordinary evening somewhere in Victorian Britain. The streets are dim, their cobbles slick with mist. In the distance, the last iron wheels of a carriage whisper against the stones. A faint odour of soot and dampness clings to everything, to the iron railings, to the coats of those hurrying home, and to the tall facades of the houses that seem to lean slightly forward, as though eavesdropping on the world passing beneath them. This was the 19th century's domestic revolution, a time when architecture swelled with confidence, when homes grew not merely larger but more expressive, their facades filled with ornament, their interiors layered with wallpaper, drapery, and the slow sigh of burning coal. The Industrial Revolution had brought wealth to some, and aspiration to many. Streets filled with terraced homes unfurled outward from the choking cores of London, Manchester, Liverpool, and Glasgow. They were built quickly and densely, sometimes poorly ventilated, sometimes elegant beyond reason, but always alive with movement, a restless pulse contained within brick and timber. Inside these homes, the night was never truly silent. Coal fires hissed as they settled. Wooden joists, warmed unevenly by hearth and candlelight, expanded and contracted with slow fatigue. Pipes shuddered, plaster shifted, and fabric whispered as air pressed gently against thick curtains. The Victorians lived inside a constant low murmur of material life, a chorus of sighs and crackles that seemed at times to come from nowhere. When a house groaned in the early hours, there was no one to see what caused it, only the certainty that something, somewhere within the walls, had stirred. These noises were not merely incidental, they became part of the domestic rhythm, woven into the perception of what a house was, a container not only of people but of invisible forces. For most families, sound was an unavoidable companion. The streets were filled with the rattle of carts, the bark of dogs, and the hum of industry. But inside, sound became intimate, muffled, echoing through narrow stairwells and hollow walls. Many Victorian houses were built with lath and plaster, thin wooden slats nailed closely together, over which plaster was troweled to form the interior walls. As those slats aged and dried, they loosened slightly, creating tiny cavities where air could pass and sound could travel, sometimes from one room to another in ways that defied logic. Add to that the materials of progress. Gaslight, introduced in the early decades of the century, required pipes to snake through walls and ceilings. These metal arteries expanded with heat when the lamps were lit, then contracted again when extinguished, creating clicks, knocks, and faint metallic sighs. The same with plumbing. As clean water systems spread through the cities, pipes gurgled and spluttered, echoing through the wooden floors. For those unused to such technology, the sound seemed uncanny, unpredictable. The house itself appeared to speak in the language of the unseen. Outside, the air carried its own heavy silence. The famous London fog, that thick, yellowed mixture of smoke and moisture, crept into every crevice, blurring the distinction between indoors and out. In those evenings when gaslight flickered weakly against the haze, a person could easily imagine that the house breathed, exhaling faint warmth into the cool air. The combination of industrial soot and damp created an environment where every texture felt alive: the chill metal of a doorknob, the soft give of an old carpet, the muted resonance of footsteps on stair treads that had grown hollow from use. To modern ears, these sensations might seem purely mechanical, but to Victorians steeped in both faith and fascination with the unseen, the home's murmurs carried deeper meaning. Death was a constant presence, life expectancy was short, and mourning rituals elaborate. It was common to keep portraits of the deceased in the parlor, or even to photograph them one last time in post-mortem stillness. In a world so comfortable with ghosts as metaphor and memory, the noises of the house took on emotional resonance. When the wind slipped through the chimney and sighed, it might be said that someone was paying a visit. When a floorboard creaked under an invisible step, there was comfort in imagining company rather than emptiness. The social order of the time only deepened this intimacy with domestic sound. Servants moved quietly through the night hours, stoking fires, emptying ashes, turning down lamps. Their movement created a background rhythm, a subtle shifting of floorboards, a click of a latch, a whisper of fabric. Even in sleep, the residents of these homes existed within a faint web of noises, many of them human but unacknowledged, blending into the fabric of the house itself. The architecture of the Victorian home thus became an acoustic chamber of its society, rigidly divided by class, layered vertically with servants below and family above, and yet joined together through the silent transmission of sound. Beyond the home's physical qualities lay the moral architecture of the era. The Victorians prized privacy and respectability, and their houses mirrored those values. Thick curtains blocked the gaze of the street, and long corridors separated public and private spaces. Yet this pursuit of privacy created isolation, and isolation sharpened the ear. In the stillness of drawing rooms, where clocks ticked with relentless precision, small noises swelled to significance. The human mind, deprived of activity, became attuned to the subtlest disturbances. A settling beam became a whisper. The faint scratching of mice in the walls became, if one wished, a message from the other side. By the mid-19th century, these homes had multiplied across Britain and beyond, spreading to the colonies and to the young cities of America. Everywhere they went, they carried the same mixture of grandeur and gloom, elaborate facades concealing dim interiors where sound and shadow mingled. For many, these houses symbolized progress, yet they also contained reminders of decay. The coal that warmed them blackened their ceilings. The very bricks that insulated them trapped dampness in their cores. Over time, the materials aged unevenly, producing new tones, soft pops, faint groans, and the delicate whisper of plaster dust falling unseen behind walls. It was in this setting, half industrial, half spectral, that the Victorian imagination learned to listen differently. Sound became the bridge between science and superstition, between the tangible and the ghostly. The same ears that thrilled to the hum of machinery also strained to catch voices in the silence of the parlor. To live in a Victorian house was to exist inside a conversation between matter and mind, between the ordinary and the inexplicable, and as the years moved forward, as these homes aged and their timbers dried, the conversation only grew louder. The Victorians began to wonder what their houses might be saying, and to whom. The voice of a Victorian house did not come from nowhere. It came from its bones, from the wood, the brick, the iron, and the layers of plaster that enclosed air and silence in equal measure. Each creak had a reason, each sigh a source. To understand why these homes seemed to whisper, one must first understand what they were made of. The typical Victorian house began as an accumulation of materials drawn from an industrial world newly capable of abundance. Brick, once the product of small local kilns, was now mass-produced in factories. Timber was imported from Scandinavia and North America, sawn in precise dimensions, dried, and shipped by rail. Iron arrived from the foundries of Birmingham and Sheffield, not only for gates and railings but for the very skeleton of the home, the columns, brackets, and joists that lent it strength. What had once been handmade was now machine perfect, yet in that perfection there lurked imperfection of another kind, a cold precision that made every floor resonate. The walls of a Victorian house were, for their time, a marvel of construction. Builders began with 2 layers of brick separated by a narrow cavity, a primitive form of insulation, though it often trapped moisture instead of keeping it out. Inside, wooden laths, thin, flat strips, were nailed across vertical studs, forming a kind of open lattice. Over these, plasterers applied several coats of lime plaster mixed with horsehair for strength. As the plaster dried, it bonded with the laths, creating a skin that could flex with the movement of the house. But as decades passed, that skin loosened, the bond weakened. Tiny gaps opened between the laths and the plaster, turning the walls into a web of hidden chambers. Through them, sound could slip and scatter, rising from the basement to the attic in slow, muffled waves. A knock in one room might echo faintly in another, with no clear path between them. Floors, too, were instruments. The joists, thick beams of pine or oak, stretched from wall to wall, supporting wide planks above. Between those planks, builders sometimes left hollow spaces for pipes or for nothing at all. When air moved through them, the house breathed audibly. In winter, heat from coal fires caused the boards to expand. At night, as the fire died and cold crept back, the boards contracted, producing the sharp, dry pops that so often startled the sleepless. To the Victorians, unused to central heating or stable indoor temperatures, these sounds seemed alive, the audible rhythm of a structure responding to weather and time. Then there was the plumbing, that late-century innovation both miraculous and troublesome. Early systems relied on cast-iron pipes joined with lead and hemp, running through walls and beneath floors. They clanked when hot water rushed through them, hissed when air pockets formed, and groaned when cooling metal shrank against its fittings. Trapped water could vibrate through the iron like the string of an instrument. Entire rooms might hum faintly without cause. When at last water closets became common in middle-class homes, they added their own secret sounds, the drip of cisterns, the echo of flushing mechanisms, the tremor of pipes extending down into unseen cellars. Gaslight, too, introduced a private music. Gas flowed through narrow pipes of tin or brass, each joint sealed imperfectly with putty or thread. When valves opened or closed, pressure shifted, causing a low whine or a whispering hiss. Sometimes, impurities in the gas caused miniature explosions inside burners, soft percussive puffs that startled anyone sitting near. The Victorians were accustomed to these small dramas, they accepted them as part of domestic life. Yet for those with imagination, they blurred the line between physics and presence. Heating systems were no less vocal. Cast-iron radiators, introduced in the mid-19th century, clicked and clanged as steam coursed through them. Air trapped within created knocking sounds, especially when pressure fluctuated. The rhythm of expansion and contraction was unpredictable. A house might remain still for hours, then suddenly rattle awake, like a restless sleeper turning in bed. In an age when the supernatural still hovered at the edge of science, such noises carried suggestion. To the rational mind they were mechanical, to the sensitive ear, perhaps something more. Even the decorative features of the house contributed to its voice. Ornamental ceilings, rich with plaster moldings, created cavities that amplified certain frequencies. Heavy draperies absorbed others, producing strange pockets of silence. Long corridors and stairwells acted as echo chambers, turning footsteps into lingering ghosts of sound. Mirrors, a favorite of Victorian decor, reflected light, but also affected perception of space, and with it, the way sound seemed to move. A noise heard near a mirror could appear to come from behind it. an illusion both visual and auditory. The Victorians did not design their homes to be haunted, yet the very complexity of their architecture made haunting inevitable. These were layered buildings, full of compartments, voids, and narrow passages. Behind every wall was another wall, behind every ceiling an attic, beneath every stair a hollow. Air circulated unpredictably, carrying the faint scents of coal, candle wax, and human life. In the quiet hours those scents mingled with sound, creating an atmosphere thick enough to imagine presences that were not there. Modern building science can trace each noise to its origin: temperature differentials, structural movement, moisture content, resonance. But to those who lived inside these houses more than a century ago, such explanations were not yet available. Physics existed, but psychology prevailed. The Victorians valued reason, yet they also cherished mystery. Their homes, caught between these two impulses, became theatres for both. A gentleman might study the acoustics of his drawing room one day, and attend a séance in the same room the next. The walls that carried his voice also carried his wonder. Over time, the orchestra of the house became part of its identity. People grew familiar with the individual sounds of their homes: the specific groan of a stair, the faint rattle of a window in wind, the sigh that came each night from the hearth as the coals cooled. These noises reassured as much as they disturbed. They marked continuity, proof that the house was still standing, still breathing, still part of the world of the living. And when the house changed hands, when new families moved in and old memories lingered in the walls, those same sounds might be mistaken for something else entirely. In this way, architecture shaped imagination. The materials that built the modern home also built its myths. Iron and brick made the skeleton, plaster and lath the flesh, pipes and radiators the veins and arteries. Through them flowed not only heat and air, but the murmurs that gave the Victorian house its peculiar half-life. Not dead, not alive, but perpetually whispering. As the century advanced, and as invention followed invention, the sounds multiplied. Each improvement introduced another tone, another vibration, another whisper that blurred the line between comfort and unease. And so in the next chapter of this story, when the first truly modern conveniences arrived, the plumbing, the gaslight, the mysterious metalwork running through walls, the voices of the house would only grow louder. By the time the 19th century reached its middle decades, the silence of older houses had been replaced by a new and restless voice, a mechanical whisper that ran through floors and walls. Progress had come indoors. Water and gas, once luxuries, now coursed through networks of iron and brass that turned the private home into a small machine. The pipes, hidden yet vital, became the unseen organs of domestic life. They brought comfort, cleanliness, and light. They also brought noise, a constant, unpredictable music that made many wonder if their houses were trying to speak. The Victorians were among the first to live with plumbing in its modern form. Before the 1840s, most urban homes relied on hand-pumped wells and cisterns. Waste was carried away in pails or open drains. As public health reform gathered force after outbreaks of cholera, engineers like Edwin Chadwick and Joseph Bazalgette began to imagine the house as part of a city-wide system of flow, an organism connected by pipes. Iron water mains stretched beneath the streets of London, Liverpool, and Manchester, branching into narrow leads that entered each dwelling through basements or cellars. Inside, the pipes climbed upward, feeding kitchens and sculleries, bathrooms and water closets. The first sound that householders noticed was the rush, that low, throaty vibration as water filled a line after a tap was opened. Because early pipes lacked pressure regulators, the flow could surge violently, producing shudders that rattled through floors. When valves were closed suddenly, the momentum of moving water created what engineers later called hydraulic shock or water hammer, a sharp, percussive thud that echoed like a distant knock. People heard it at night, when the house was otherwise still, and wondered who or what had rapped upon the walls. Gas arrived with equal strangeness. By the 1820s, major British cities were webbed with gas mains, delivering coal gas to street lamps. Within a generation, that network extended into private homes. Thin metal pipes ran along joists and behind plaster, feeding small burners in parlors, corridors, and stairwells. Each burner hissed faintly when lit, a steady exhalation that never quite ceased. Pressure fluctuations sent little pulses through the system. Impurities in the gas caused the flames to flutter, and with them came faint popping sounds, soft, rhythmic, almost conversational. When a valve leaked, the gas escaping through the tiniest fissure produced a noise unlike anything the human ear had known before, a whisper without breath, a voice made of chemistry. The Victorians listened with curiosity and unease. The home had once been a wooden shell that responded to wind and weather, but these new voices were internal, intimate, almost secret. They came from behind the wallpaper, from beneath the floorboards, from within the very ribs of the house. Some homeowners wrote letters to builders or newspapers, complaining of mysterious talking pipes. Others described them with wonder. A writer in the Builder magazine in 1859 noted that the modern dwelling has acquired, by the introduction of gas and water, an unaccountable faculty of murmuring. Science could explain most of it. Iron expands when heated, contracts when cooled. Water and steam carry vibration. Gas escaping through narrow apertures behaves like a reed instrument. Yet explanation did not always soothe. In the half-light of gas-lit evenings, the difference between mechanism and haunting was subtle. The Victorians already lived among metaphors of communication, the telegraph, the phonograph, and later the telephone, all technologies that made invisible forces audible. When pipes hissed or radiators knocked, it was easy to imagine the house as a transmitter of messages from beyond. Moisture added its own accents. Condensation formed inside cold iron, dripping with a slow, deliberate rhythm that echoed in the cavities of the walls. Trapped air bubbles gurgled upward, producing sounds like distant voices underwater. In large houses with complicated plumbing, these noises seemed to travel purposefully, beginning in one corner and ending in another, as though following an unseen path. Servants, often awake late into the night, grew accustomed to them, though they still startled guests unprepared for the nocturnal speech of pipes. When the sanitary movement gathered pace in the 1860s and 1870s, architects and engineers debated how to quiet these systems. Soundproofing was rudimentary. Few realized how efficiently wood and plaster carried vibration. Builders experimented with lead linings and felt insulation, but the problem persisted. The more intricate the plumbing became, the more voices it produced. In some homes, particularly those retrofitted with both gas and water, the two systems crossed paths, their noises overlapping, a faint hiss from one wall answered by a gurgle from another, like a conversation between invisible inhabitants. To those inclined toward spiritualism, such coincidences offered proof. The same decades that brought the water closet also brought the seance. The Fox sisters' rappings in New York had made transatlantic headlines. Table turning and spirit photography filled the leisure hours of the middle class. A knock in the wall could be mechanical, or it could be a message. Few people cared to decide which. The comfort of believing in presence often outweighed the certainty of knowing there was none. Writers noticed the new vocabulary of sound. Charles Dickens, ever attentive to domestic detail, described in Dombey and Son the creaking stairs, the ticking clock, the hollow echo of the empty rooms. Later, in ghost stories by writers such as Elizabeth Gaskell and M.R. James, the haunted house became a familiar stage, its atmosphere built not on screams but on subtle noises, a drip, a sigh, a quiet shifting of boards. These literary ghosts owed much to plumbing and gas. The modern house provided the soundtrack. Over decades, as houses aged and their systems corroded, the voices deepened. Iron pipes rusted from within, roughening the interior surfaces so that water flowed turbulently, creating new tones. Gas lines leaked minutely at joints, producing faint odors and sibilant murmurs. Radiators loosened on their mountings, adding a hollow clang to the nightly chorus. Every sound was the trace of entropy, the audible evidence of time working its way through metal and stone. By the end of the century, when electricity began to replace gaslight, the vocabulary of noise changed again. The hum of dynamos, the click of switches, the soft buzz of filaments joined the chorus. Yet the older sounds did not vanish, they lingered in basements and attics in the parts of the house too costly or inconvenient to modernize. The Victorian home, even in its later years, remained polyphonic, a structure that could never be entirely silent, and so the house became a paradox. It was the emblem of progress, filled with the miracles of engineering, yet it spoke with the language of ghosts. Its murmurs were the byproduct of improvement, the unintended poetry of pipes and pressure. The Victorians, torn between science and superstition, lived in both worlds at once. When their houses sighed, they listened, not because they truly believed in haunting, but because they secretly wished that the past or someone from it might still be trying to speak. Moisture added its own accents. Condensation formed inside cold iron, dripping with a slow, deliberate rhythm that echoed in the cavities of the walls. Trapped air bubbles gurgled upward, producing sounds like distant voices underwater. In large houses with complicated plumbing, these noises seemed to travel purposefully, beginning in one corner and ending in another, as though following an unseen path. Servants, often awake late into the night, grew accustomed to them, though they still startled guests unprepared for the nocturnal speech of pipes. When the sanitary movement gathered pace in the 1860s and 1870s, architects and engineers debated how to quiet these systems. Soundproofing was rudimentary. Few realized how efficiently wood and plaster carried vibration. Builders experimented with lead linings and felt insulation, but the problem persisted. The more intricate the plumbing became, the more voices it produced. In some homes, particularly those retrofitted with both gas and water, the two systems crossed paths, their noises overlapping, a faint hiss from one wall answered by a gurgle from another, like a conversation between invisible inhabitants. To those inclined toward spiritualism, such coincidences offered proof. The same decades that brought the water closet also brought the seance. The Fox sisters' rappings in New York had made transatlantic headlines. Table turning and spirit photography filled the leisure hours of the middle class. A knock in the wall could be mechanical, or it could be a message. Few people cared to decide which. The comfort of believing in presence often outweighed the certainty of knowing there was none. Writers noticed the new vocabulary of sound. Charles Dickens, ever attentive to domestic detail, described in Dombey and Son the creaking stairs, the ticking clock, the hollow echo of the empty rooms. Later, in ghost stories by writers such as Elizabeth Gaskell and M.R. James, the haunted house became a familiar stage, its atmosphere built not on screams but on subtle noises, a drip, a sigh, a quiet shifting of boards. These literary ghosts owed much to plumbing and gas. The modern house provided the soundtrack. Over decades, as houses aged and their systems corroded, the voices deepened. Iron pipes rusted from within, roughening the interior surfaces so that water flowed turbulently, creating new tones. Gas lines leaked minutely at joints, producing faint odors and sibilant murmurs. Radiators loosened on their mountings, adding a hollow clang to the nightly chorus. Every sound was the trace of entropy, the audible evidence of time working its way through metal and stone. By the end of the century, when electricity began to replace gaslight, the vocabulary of noise changed again. The hum of dynamos, the click of switches, the soft buzz of filaments joined the chorus. Yet the older sounds did not vanish, they lingered in basements and attics in the parts of the house too costly or inconvenient to modernize. The Victorian home, even in its later years, remained polyphonic, a structure that could never be entirely silent, and so the house became a paradox. It was the emblem of progress, filled with the miracles of engineering, yet it spoke with the language of ghosts. Its murmurs were the byproduct of improvement, the unintended poetry of pipes and pressure. The Victorians, torn between science and superstition, lived in both worlds at once. When their houses sighed, they listened, not because they truly believed in haunting, but because they secretly wished that the past or someone from it might still be trying to speak. Those who grew up in such homes learned the vocabulary early. Children lying awake could map the house by ear. The groan of the landing board, the faint crack from the window frame, the whisper that came when the door swelled tight against its jamb. Each sound meant something. A single loud pop from the attic might announce rain approaching. A long, low creak across the ceiling might mean frost was setting in. To the attentive, the house forecast the weather better than any barometer. Moisture was the great conductor. In winter, coal fires dried the air. Wood shrank and loosened, leaving gaps that whistled with drafts. In summer, when London's air grew thick and heavy, the boards swelled again, pressing against one another until nails squealed softly in protest. Builders called this working of timber, a phrase that suggested effort, even labor, as if the house itself were toiling to stay together. Over decades, that work left traces. The floors of old Victorian houses often dip toward the center, where beams have bent infinitesimally under the weight of years. With each shift came a noise, a creak that began when a tree was young and ended when the timber finally settled into stillness. These were not flaws, but part of the architecture's personality. A silent wooden house would have seemed uncanny. Writers of the era often drew on this auditory intimacy. In Wuthering Heights, Emily Bronte describes the old house as alive with sound, its groaning rafters and shuddering shutters reacting to the moorland wind. Henry James, in The Turn of the Screw, made an entire atmosphere out of quiet noises. The sigh of the stair, the faint shift of boards, the ghost that might be nothing more than a house adjusting to the night. Such descriptions were not invention but recognition. The Victorians lived so closely with their buildings that they came to treat them almost as living companions. From a scientific view, the explanation is simple. As temperatures change, wood expands and contracts by about 0.002 inches per foot for every 10 degrees Fahrenheit of variation. Multiply that across dozens of beams, and you have a living symphony of motion. Add iron nails that heat and cool at different rates, and every joint becomes a tiny instrument. The sound of a house is physics rendered in slow motion, but the beauty of those creaks lay not in their cause but in their cadence. The noises were irregular yet reassuring, proof that the structure still moved, still breathed. They reminded their listeners that stillness was not natural, that even walls were part of the world's ongoing change. To sleep inside such a house was to rest in the arms of something alive, something that never quite stopped adjusting to time. Even today, in old neighborhoods where Victorian houses still stand, the language persists. You can hear it after dusk, the long, slow exhale of timber releasing the day's warmth, the faint answering crack from a distant wall. It is easy to imagine the building murmuring to itself, recalling the hands that built it, the fires that once burned inside, the rain that once soaked its bones. The creaking of wood is not a flaw, it is memory, made audible. And so, when the night deepens and the world outside grows quiet, the house begins its own conversation once more. A dialogue between age and air, between warmth and cold. It is a language without words, yet full of meaning. The sound of a home remembering that it is still alive. And then there were the rooms themselves. Vast, tall, and often too large for the few who moved within them. After the murmuring of beams and the whisper of wood, there was the deeper resonance of space, the hollow, breathing quiet that filled Victorian parlours once laughter and conversation had gone. The age of whispering timber gave way to another kind of language, that of the echo. Victorian houses were not built small, even middle-class homes, pressed side by side along terrace streets, carried aspirations of grandeur, ceilings stretched high, as if to lift the occupants nearer to refinement. Hallways ran long and narrow, their ends vanishing into shadow. Drawing rooms were built for company, but company did not always come. The architecture itself encouraged emptiness, the kind that holds on to sound longer than it should. In those days, people thought of acoustics less as science and more as an aspect of character. A well-appointed home was meant to sound dignified. The hard surfaces, plaster walls, polished floors, marble mantels, reflected every footstep, every word. Sound did not die quickly in such spaces. It lingered, folding back upon itself in faint repetitions. The very design of the home amplified loneliness. When a servant closed a door in the far wing, its echo reached the parlor like the fading note of a church bell. The grander the house, the longer the echo. Wealthy Victorians prized this subtle grandeur. Voices carried, footsteps announced. The drawing room resounded like a small chapel. It gave presence to silence, and in giving it presence gave it power. When evening fell and fires dimmed, those same acoustics turned strange. A room once meant to impress became an empty chamber, where sound repeated too long, too low. One could whisper and hear it answered by oneself, distant and altered, as if someone else stood waiting in the corners. The high ceilings of Victorian homes were not simply decorative. They were born of practical need, to disperse the heavy warmth of coal fires and gas lamps. But their effect on sound was profound. Voices rose, travelled upward, and dissolved in the upper air, leaving behind a ghost of themselves. In these vertical spaces, the living spoke into a kind of soft abyss. Conversations felt temporary. Songs drifted upward and were swallowed. What remained was resonance, the faint afterimage of sound that filled the emptiness once the house grew still. Music was one of the few sounds that belonged naturally in such spaces. Many parlors held upright pianos, their lids lifted to release careful melodies into the long corridors. Women practiced scales in the afternoon, their notes traveling unevenly through the house, bouncing from wall to wall until they thinned into nothing. The Victorians prized these instruments, not only for their refinement, but for the atmosphere they created. Warmth in a room otherwise too large for one voice. When the last note faded, the silence that followed felt heavier, deeper, and almost sentient. The echo itself became a kind of companion. In smaller homes, acoustics worked differently. The narrow halls and multiple doors broke sound into fragments. A conversation in the kitchen might emerge as a muffled hum in the upstairs bedroom. The wind found its own roots through vents and keyholes, producing soft flute-like tones. Houses built in rows shared thin walls. Neighbors' movements became part of the domestic orchestra. The Victorians were accustomed to these sounds, but they did not always interpret them as mechanical. To ears unaccustomed to understanding sound as physics, the slow travel of noise through plaster and pipe felt inexplicable, ghostly, even tender. Sound had a way of revealing what sight could not. A room might appear empty, but a single echo betrayed its shape. When footsteps crossed a parlor, one could sense how far the walls stood apart, how high the ceiling arched. The human ear learned the house by listening. A familiar creak told you which stair you'd reached. The soft return of your own voice told you whether the room was open or closed. Every house trained its inhabitants to hear its private dialect. Historians of architecture often note how the Victorians tried to control sound, even as they created it. Heavy draperies and upholstered furniture were not only marks of taste, they were acts of acoustic management. Thick curtains absorbed the sharper echoes, carpets muffled footsteps and tapestries softened walls, yet complete silence was rarely achieved. Beneath the velvet and lace, the older bones of the building still whispered. A parlor could never be completely still because stillness, in the 19th century, was not part of life. Coal settled, firewood cracked, floors breathed. The home was an instrument constantly tuning itself. Servants' quarters, often located in basements or attics, heard the house differently. In the lower corridors, pipes and drains provided a ceaseless undercurrent of gurgling, dripping, and clanking. Above in the garrets, wind played through the eaves, whistling faintly between tiles. The rich heard their houses as murmurs, the poor heard them as labor. Sound mapped social position as clearly as any staircase. In this way, acoustics mirrored the Victorian mind, preoccupied with separation and hierarchy, yet always haunted by what connected everything beneath the surface. The echo that lingered in a drawing room was the same air that filled a servant's attic. Sound dissolved barriers, reminding all who listened that the walls dividing upstairs and downstairs, family and staff, were more porous than they appeared. To live surrounded by echoes is to live with memory. Each sound carries the trace of what made it. When a voice fades, its shape remains, briefly imprinted on the air. In the slow rhythm of a Victorian evening, these traces piled up invisibly. A visitor's laughter, the clink of teacups, the sigh of a closing door all lingered as faint ghosts of themselves. The Victorians filled their houses with sound by day and inherited the echoes by night. It was not surprising that they began to think of those echoes as something more than acoustic phenomena. It felt at times like presence. Loneliness deepened the illusion. In homes where a husband had died or children had gone to school, the rooms seemed larger, the echoes longer. A widow walking through an empty parlor might hear her own steps multiplied and returned to her, just out of sync. The sound of companionship stretched thin. She might stop, listen, and for a moment believe that someone else had stopped too. In that instant, the boundary between acoustics and emotion blurred completely. The house spoke because silence had become unbearable. It is easy to imagine those evenings now, lamplight flickering against the tall plaster, the faint ticking of a mantel clock, the echo of a single movement drifting through the hall. To modern ears, accustomed to hums and engines, such quiet would feel unearthly. But for the Victorians, it was simply life, a world of resonance and distance, where homes did not just hold sound but transformed it into memory. And when at last the lamps were extinguished and the fire sank into ash, the echoes softened, folded into the stillness, and the house returned to its slow breathing, waiting for morning to wake it once more. By the mid-19th century, the world within Victorian homes was changing in ways that no one could entirely control. Industrialization had transformed the pace and texture of daily life. Streets thrummed with steam engines, factories groaned with machinery, and homes themselves became intricate systems of pipes, wires, and iron radiators. Life, once measured by the natural rhythms of light, wind, and season, was now governed by the ceaseless pulse of invention. Yet alongside these mechanical marvels arose a profound, almost desperate yearning to understand what lay beyond the measurable, the predictable, and the strictly physical. In the quiet spaces of parlor rooms, behind the walls of houses alive with subtle noises, the Victorian imagination turned naturally toward the unseen. It was in this context that spiritualism emerged as a cultural phenomenon. Across Britain, the United States, and Europe, people began seeking evidence of life after death, guided not only by grief, but also by a fascination with forces that seemed to mirror the growing intricacy of their material world. The movement promised access to voices that were faint but persistent, the kind of subtle communication the industrialized home now amplified. It was a time when the human ear, trained by creaking wood, gurgling pipes, and whispering gas lines, had developed a sensitivity to the faintest murmur, and that sensitivity would be turned toward the spiritual as well as the material. The most famous early figures in this movement were the Fox sisters, who in 1848 in Hydesville, New York, reportedly began communicating with a spirit through knocks and raps on walls and furniture. Their revelations, whether genuine or orchestrated, resonated with a society attuned to the noises of both houses and machines. In homes where gas hissed through pipes and water dripped from iron, the idea that a wall might carry the voice of the dead seemed less absurd than it might have in simpler times. Their notoriety spread quickly across continents, and within years seances, table turning, and spirit photography became standard fixtures of middle-class leisure. Victorian society was particularly receptive to these phenomena because death was never far from domestic life. Life expectancy was lower than today, childhood mortality high, and mourning rituals highly elaborate. Families kept photographs of deceased children, displayed post-mortem portraits, and wore rings containing hair of the departed. In homes where echoes carried endlessly through empty parlors, where the timbers groaned with memory, it seemed almost inevitable that some might interpret ordinary sounds as evidence of presence. The home, already alive with sound, became a stage for communication with the beyond. Spiritualism offered both comfort and intrigue. It promised that the unseen could be observed and engaged with, that messages could be exchanged across the divide of life and death. Mediums acted as interpreters, translating raps, tremors, or faint shifts in the air into meaning. The movement also reflected anxieties of the era, uncertainty about rapid technological change, urbanization, and the social upheaval of industrial progress. Just as houses carried hidden voices through pipes and walls, so too did the culture carry hidden fears and hopes, which spiritualism brought to audible life. Yet the fascination was not confined to the grief-stricken. The wealthy, the intellectual, and the socially prominent were often participants, seeking both entertainment and enlightenment. Seances were conducted in candlelit parlors, where participants listened intently for subtle sounds, a knock, a shuffle, the faint rustle of a curtain, each interpreted as a deliberate message. Those who lived amidst the ceaseless hum of machinery might have found a strange resonance between the physical and the metaphysical, both invisible, both powerful, both shaping the rhythms of domestic life. Even literature absorbed this attention to unseen presence. Authors such as Elizabeth Gaskell and Charlotte Riddell wrote ghost stories set against the backdrop of increasingly complex domestic spaces, often drawing directly from the sounds and atmospheres of real Victorian homes. The familiar hum of pipes, the gurgle of drains, the creak of timbers became not just technical details, but metaphors for hidden forces, unseen memories, and the possibility of communication beyond the immediate senses. In effect, the Victorian house itself had become a participant in the spiritual drama, its mechanical and acoustic properties lending plausibility to experiences that might otherwise have seemed impossible. Scientific developments, rather than undermining belief, often intensified it. Telegraphy, photography, and early experiments in electricity suggested that unseen forces could be measured, captured, and transmitted. If electricity could move invisibly through wires and light could be recorded on chemically treated plates, why could not spirits act similarly? Homes full of gas, water, and iron now also seemed full of possibility, unseen currents carrying faint signals from one plane to another. For many, the echoing walls and vibrating timbers of their own houses became conduits of wonder rather than merely mechanical irritants. This convergence of material and immaterial experience, of technological and spiritual curiosity, shaped a distinctive Victorian sensibility. The everyday noises of a house, the drip of water, the hiss of gas, the sigh of timber, were no longer merely evidence of construction. They were invitations to listen, to imagine, and to hope. A creak in the floor became the voice of a departed relative. A groan in a stairwell became the messenger of a long-gone friend. The home was at once familiar and uncanny, intimate and expansive, a space where science, superstition, and imagination collided quietly in the night. By the late 19th century, spiritualism had become a firmly embedded feature of Victorian culture. Guidebooks, manuals, and popular pamphlets instructed readers on the interpretation of raps, the movement of tables, and the detection of ghostly sounds. The homes themselves, built for comfort and social display, had unintentionally facilitated these experiences. Their acoustics, their hidden chambers, and the constant mechanical noises of modern convenience had all prepared ears to hear things that were not strictly audible, to perceive presences that were not strictly visible. In this way, the Victorian house was not merely a backdrop to spiritualism, it was an active participant in its creation. And so, as the century continued, the domestic environment and the cultural imagination became intertwined. The noises of a house, the rhythm of mechanical systems, and the lingering echoes of empty parlors all combined to shape a perception of the world in which presence and absence, life and death, and matter and spirit coexisted in quiet, persistent conversation. It was a world in which every sigh of timber, every hiss of gas, every drip of water might carry more than its apparent weight, suggesting that the house itself was listening, remembering, and perhaps even responding. Within the Victorian home, the drawing room was more than a place of social display. It was a carefully curated stage, a space where light, furniture and architectural acoustics converged to create atmosphere. It was in these rooms, often dimly lit with gas lamps or flickering candles, that spiritualism found its most intimate expression. The parlor became a theater of the unseen, a chamber in which domestic architecture and ritual merged into a slow, almost hypnotic performance. Every shadow, every reflective surface, every creak of the floor contributed to the experience, providing both context and suggestion. By the mid-19th century, spiritualist practices had begun to penetrate ordinary homes. Guidebooks instructed families on how to prepare a parlor for a séance. The arrangement of chairs around a table, the use of heavy drapes to mute external noise, the careful dimming of lights to a level that suggested mystery without causing discomfort. Gas jets were lowered to their softest flame, allowing shadows to stretch across walls and ceilings. Mirrors, strategically placed, reflected light and movement in ways that amplified the room's otherworldly quality. Even the ordinary acoustics of the parlor, the long corridors leading to it, the high ceilings, the hollowing of floors beneath, contributed to an environment ripe for faint noises to be interpreted as something more than mechanical. Central to these rituals was the table itself. Often a simple wooden construction, it was transformed during séances into a conduit of communication. Participants would place their hands lightly on its surface, awaiting the mysterious raps and knocks that were said to carry messages from the spirit world. These sounds, faint and irregular, were easily produced by the subtle movements of the participants themselves. Involuntary flexing of muscles, tiny shifts of weight, even changes in temperature affecting the table's wood. Yet in a parlor already attuned to subtle noises, these signals could be, and often were, interpreted as authentic responses from the beyond. Other instruments of spiritualism enhanced this effect. Speaking trumpets, thin wooden or metal devices that amplified whispers, allowed medium and participants to perceive sounds seemingly originating from nowhere. They were placed carefully in corners or on mantels, channels through which the invisible could speak to the living. As gas flickered and shadows moved, the faint amplification of a whisper could seem eerie and intentional. The design of the room itself, walls of lath and plaster, hollowed spaces, resonant floors, carried these sounds in ways that seemed impossible, as though the house itself were participating in the ritual. Architecture and ritual were entwined in subtle ways. High ceilings, intended for ventilation and aesthetic grandeur, lengthened echoes so that a small knock or shuffle could reverberate like a measured response from across the room. Long corridors acted as conduits, carrying the softest noises from one space to another, so that footsteps on a distant landing or the shifting of chairs could be misinterpreted as evidence of presence. Even the positioning of windows influenced airflow, and air currents played across wooden surfaces, creating soft hums, creaks, and sighs. In the half-light, the mind inclined to pattern finding could easily attribute intention to these occurrences. Victorian families, particularly those familiar with grief and loss, often participated with a mixture of reverence and expectation. The rituals of spiritualism, calling the spirits of loved ones, receiving messages through raps, the careful recording of every sound, were designed to be immersive. Participants were instructed to remain still, to listen attentively, to observe subtle changes in light and shadow. In doing so, they heightened their awareness of every ambient sound the house produced. The hum of a radiator, the drip of a cistern, the sigh of timber became part of the séance, reinforcing the impression that the house itself was aware, responsive, and alive in a profoundly unusual way. Artists and writers of the era noted this overlap between architecture and ritual. Elizabeth Gaskell, in her ghostly sketches of middle-class homes, highlighted how empty parlors, set with care and shadowed by drapes, could turn mundane objects, chairs, tables, draperies, into sources of fear and fascination. James later elaborated on similar ideas. The old house was not merely a backdrop, but an active participant in creating the atmosphere for encounters with the unseen. Its structure, materials, and concealed spaces allowed faint noises to travel and blend in ways that reinforced belief, blurring the boundary between mechanical and supernatural. The participation of architecture in spiritualist ritual had practical dimensions as well. Victorian homes were rarely uniform. Uneven floors, warped wood, and variations in plaster thickness altered how sound traveled. Mediums and families adapted to these idiosyncrasies, interpreting the house's natural acoustic tendencies as part of the ritual experience. In some cases, specialized furniture or platforms were employed to exaggerate or direct sounds, creating a subtle choreography in which the room itself was an active collaborator. The goal was not deception alone, but immersion, a carefully constructed sensory environment in which the boundary between the living and the dead seemed permeable. What emerged then was a unique domestic phenomenon, the parlor as a space of layered meaning. On one level, it was a comfortable, decorated room, a place for tea, music, and conversation. On another, it became a chamber for spiritual communication, its acoustics, furnishings, and spatial arrangement guiding perception and heightening sensitivity to the faintest of sounds. The ordinary noises of the house, creaks, knocks, hisses, and hums, were recast as messages, as signs of presence, as evidence that the boundary between life and death was not absolute. The house, its architecture, and its inhabitants together produced an environment in which the unseen seemed tangible. Even today, one can enter such a parlor and sense the layering of experience. The materials, the echoes, the proportions of the room, and the ambient noises contribute to a lingering impression of interaction, as though the past, the structure, and the imagination are entwined in a quiet, ongoing dialogue. In the Victorian mind, this blending of architecture and ritual offered comfort, fascination, and the thrill of possibility. The idea that the house itself, with all its creaks, groans, and echoes, could serve as both stage and participant in the mysteries of the unseen. In the parlors of the dead, sound, space, and expectation met seamlessly. The house spoke softly, the medium interpreted the whispers, and the participants listened, suspended in an atmosphere where architecture, ritual, and imagination became indistinguishable. Every subtle creak of timber, every faint vibration from hidden pipes, every shifting shadow contributed to the impression that life and presence continued, quietly, beyond the visible and the known. By the closing decades of the 19th century, a new presence entered the Victorian home: electricity. Its arrival, tentative and experimental at first, introduced a subtle and often eerie layer to domestic experience. Homes had long been alive with sound, the creaking of timber, the whisper of pipes, the echoing of footsteps through high-ceilinged parlors. Now they began to glow, flicker, and hum with an energy that was at once tangible and invisible, bridging the world of the seen and the unseen, in ways that the Victorian imagination could scarcely ignore. Electricity in domestic life began cautiously. In London and other industrial cities, wealthy homeowners experimented with arc lamps and early incandescent bulbs in parlors and libraries, fascinated by the new light that seemed to float without fire or fuel. Early wiring was rudimentary. Unshielded copper wires ran along walls and ceilings, often hidden in hollowed spaces, and switches were placed where they could be reached, but were not entirely obvious. These installations brought novelty, convenience, and danger in equal measure. Sparks, faint buzzing, and sudden flickers became part of the nighttime experience, blending with the existing hum of pipes, wood, and gas. Static discharges were common. The very air in rooms filled with early electrical installations often carried a subtle charge, detectable in the sudden crackle as one moved across carpets or touched a doorknob. These small shocks, entirely explainable by modern science, would have appeared mysterious, even threatening, to inhabitants unaccustomed to electrical phenomena. In candlelit parlors, where flickering shadows already suggested hidden presences, the sudden flare of a bulb or the tiny shock from a metallic object could be interpreted as the intrusion of spirits or unseen forces. The house itself seemed to respond, as if aware of the experiments being conducted within its walls. Wiring and electrical devices. added an unfamiliar vocabulary of sound. Thin wires vibrated with current, producing faint, continuous buzzing or humming. Motors, generators, and early dynamo equipment, sometimes located in cellars or basements, transmitted low-frequency vibrations through floors and walls. To ears accustomed to the creak of wood and the gurgle of water, these noises suggested the presence of another life, mechanical, invisible, and continuous. They were neither fully external nor fully human, occupying a liminal space between physical reality and imagined presence. This new electrical dimension of the home complemented the practices of spiritualism. Many Victorian experimenters were drawn to electricity precisely because it seemed to make invisible forces manifest. Light could appear without fire, movement could be transmitted without touch, and sound could resonate in ways previously unimaginable. Seances, long accustomed to gaslit flicker and subtle mechanical noises, now incorporated electric candles, telegraph-like devices, and rudimentary speakers to amplify whispers or simulate responses. In this sense, the modern house became both laboratory and seance chamber, its hidden currents of energy lending plausibility to experiences of presence and communication beyond the ordinary. The unpredictability of early electrical systems heightened their uncanny effect. Flickering lights, uneven currents, and minor surges caused lamps to dim, blaze, or buzz intermittently. The human eye, already trained by candlelight to notice faint movement, interpreted these fluctuations as signs of activity. A shadow that leapt across a room in response to a brief flicker could be read as intentional. A quiet hum traveling through walls could suggest movement in a distant corridor. Electricity did not merely illuminate the house, it animated it, imbuing the familiar with an air of subtle menace or intrigue. Scientific discourse at the time attempted to explain these phenomena, but knowledge was limited and experimental. Early electrical theorists, from Michael Faraday to Thomas Edison, were themselves navigating invisible forces, demonstrating principles that seemed magical to the general public. The Victorian home became a miniature theatre of these principles, where experimentation and observation took place in intimate spaces. Electricity, like gas and plumbing before it, transformed domestic spaces into conduits of sound, light, and vibration, all of which could be interpreted as meaningful or mysterious. Children, servants, and visitors reacted differently to these electrical novelties. To some, the faint hum of a live wire, the sporadic glow of a filament, or the shock of a charged object were thrilling curiosities. To others, they were harbingers of danger or the work of spirits. The combination of visual and auditory cues, paired with dim lighting and the natural tendency to seek patterns, created conditions in which ordinary electrical events became extraordinary, charged with narrative and meaning. In the dim parlor, the hum of a wire and the flicker of a bulb could seem indistinguishable from the intended signals of a medium or the supposed presence of a ghost. Even beyond intentional experiments, electricity shaped the domestic imagination. Homes became laboratories of sensation. The familiar rhythm of pipes, floors, and wood now interacted with invisible currents, producing layered effects. A door might click slightly as the air moved past a hidden wire. A portrait might appear momentarily distorted under flickering light. The floor might resonate softly with the hum of an attic dynamo. Each of these phenomena contributed to the sense that houses were more than inert structures. They were active participants in the domestic drama, blending material and immaterial, natural and artificial, mechanical and spectral. The arrival of electricity did not erase older sources of sound and mystery, it layered upon them. The Victorian home had always been polyphonic, timber, pipes, gas, and human activity combining into a subtle, constant hum. Electricity added a new register, quieter, more insidious, yet equally persistent. It was not only the audible buzz or the visual flicker that mattered, but the psychological effect, the knowledge that currents moved invisibly through walls and ceilings, carrying energy that could manifest unpredictably, giving ordinary houses an aura of life, response, and presence beyond explanation. In this way, the Victorian home, already attuned to subtle sound and shadow, was transformed once again. Electricity expanded the vocabulary of domestic phenomena, providing both explanation and intrigue. It was a presence felt rather than always seen, a current threading through walls, floors, and ceilings, a subtle pulse that augmented the natural creaks, groans, and echoes of earlier generations. In a home where the walls whispered, the floors sighed, and the parlor echoed, electricity became another voice, invisible, pervasive, and undeniably alive. In the vast, creaking, shadowed spaces of the Victorian home, the human ear became an instrument finely tuned to subtleties, trained over decades to distinguish between the ordinary and the extraordinary. Footsteps, creaks, drips, and the shifting sighs of timber were familiar companions. Yet, even as the household adapted to its own sounds, the scientific mind was beginning to probe these phenomena with methods both rigorous and curious. Acoustics, a field that had long existed in abstract theory, was now applied directly to domestic experience, revealing the intricate dance between physics and perception that shaped Victorian notions of the supernatural. Hermann von Helmholtz, a German physicist and physician, was among the first to systematically study the nature of sound in the mid-19th century. His research on resonators demonstrated how tones could be amplified, altered, and isolated, providing a mathematical framework for understanding how sound behaves in enclosed spaces. Helmholtz's resonators, carefully tuned glass vessels capable of isolating specific frequencies, offered insight into the way walls, floors, and ceilings could modify or sustain particular noises. Though Helmholtz himself was concerned with the science of music and speech, the implications extended far beyond. In the expansive parlors and echoing corridors of Victorian homes, subtle vibrations that might once have been dismissed as random became recognizable patterns, reverberations, overtones, and amplified harmonics that seemed to linger longer than natural. Meanwhile, contemporaries in England and elsewhere were experimenting with electricity, magnetism, and mechanical resonance. Michael Faraday's work on electromagnetic induction, though largely theoretical at the domestic scale, demonstrated the presence of invisible forces capable of producing measurable, sometimes audible effects. Faraday observed that vibrating electrical circuits could generate subtle hums or tones, and that even small currents could influence surrounding materials. In large hollowed structures, these effects were magnified. Pipes, radiators, and even timber could resonate imperceptibly, producing sounds that could easily be mistaken for footsteps, whispers, or knocks. Victorian residents, unversed in the precise physics, often interpreted these noises as evidence of the unseen, a subtle blurring of natural law and supernatural expectation. The architecture of the house itself amplified this confusion. Ceilings, often 15 feet or more in height, created long reverberation paths. Hollowed beams acted as conduits for sound, and lath and plaster walls carried vibrations from one room to another. Even minor perturbations, the settling of a floorboard, the movement of water through pipes, or the contraction of timber during temperature shifts, could produce noises that lingered and returned to the listener in altered form. In a drawing room, dimly lit by gas or candlelight, a small tap or groan could be misinterpreted, not through ignorance alone, but because the room literally bent and colored sound in ways that the brain instinctively sought to rationalize. Victorian scientists, aware of these possibilities, sometimes attempted to educate the public, publishing papers on the physics of household noises. Yet the popular imagination was less concerned with explanation than with sensation. Periodicals and pamphlets discussing haunted houses frequently noted that the floorboards themselves seemed to speak, or that the gaslight flickers in response to unseen presences, framing ordinary acoustic phenomena as extraordinary. In part, this fascination arose because human perception is inherently pattern-seeking. The mind struggles to separate causation from coincidence, and in the echoing chambers of a house built of timber, plaster, and iron, coincidence often appears deliberate. Helmholtz's experiments, alongside studies of reverberation by contemporaries in England and France, offered technical explanations that were often counterintuitive. Low-frequency sounds, imperceptible as distinct tones, could resonate through walls, producing a vague sense of pressure or movement. High-frequency harmonics, traveling along hollow pipes or floors, could produce sudden isolated taps or pops. To the untrained ear, these sounds seemed sporadic and intentional, perfectly aligned with the expectations of those hoping for, or fearing, a ghostly presence. Science thus inadvertently reinforced superstition by demonstrating that houses were capable of producing subtle, seemingly directed noises. It provided an unknowable canvas onto which imagination could project its fears. Even outside the parlor, in attics, cellars, and hidden corridors, the acoustics of fear manifested with striking subtlety. Damp basements with stone floors acted as natural echo chambers. Small drops of water or shifting timbers could produce noises that bounced across the space in unpredictable ways. Attics, often lined with warped wooden boards and exposed beams, produced high-pitched creaks and groans in response to wind or temperature shifts. Within these isolated spaces, natural sounds acquired disproportionate resonance, reinforcing the impression of other presences. Residents, trained to listen and to anticipate messages from the departed, found these acoustic anomalies compelling, if unsettling. Scientific interest, however, did not extinguish belief. Instead, it intertwined with it. Mediums and spiritualists often incorporated knowledge of acoustics into their practices. Seances were conducted in rooms chosen for their resonance. Candlelight was positioned to exaggerate shadows, and furniture was arranged to transmit subtle vibrations. Participants interpreted ordinary sounds as purposeful, and the structure of the house itself, its beams, floors, and hollow walls, was treated as an active participant in the ritual. The boundary between physics and supernatural experience was porous. The ear could hear what the mind wished to interpret, and the home, through its architecture and materials, facilitated the illusion. By the late Victorian era, the science of acoustics and the culture of spiritualism existed in a curious symbiosis. Helmholtz's theories, Faraday's experiments, and the growing understanding of resonant frequencies provided frameworks that could rationalize otherwise inexplicable sounds. Yet these frameworks also lent credibility to the idea that houses themselves might communicate or remember. Timber, plaster, and stone became conduits, carrying vibrations that were interpreted as echoes of the past, messages from the unseen, or signals from spirits. Residents of Victorian homes learned to navigate this acoustic landscape with both caution and curiosity, listening to the whispers of walls, floors, and ceilings, as if they were speaking directly to them. In essence, the Victorian house, with all its hidden mechanical and architectural complexities, became an instrument of fear, memory, and imagination. Science sought to explain the phenomena, but in doing so, it highlighted the subtlety and complexity of domestic acoustics. The human ear, ever attuned to nuance and pattern, remained both the observer and the interpreter. The result was a delicate balance, a house that was alive with sound, a science that demystified, and a mind that insisted on mystery, producing the uniquely haunting experience that has come to define Victorian domestic life. By the latter half of the 19th century, Victorian curiosity had extended beyond the walls and floors of the home into the very medium through which sound and presence travelled. Air, the invisible currents of the atmosphere, once taken for granted, became the focus of fascination, experimentation, and speculation. Just as pipes carried water and wires carried electricity, the air itself was thought to carry messages, subtle, undetectable to most, yet perfectly accessible to those attuned to its mysteries. In parlors, attics, and laboratories, Victorians began to explore the ways that sound, ether, and even spirit might be transmitted invisibly, blurring the boundary between living voice and mechanical echo. The scientific revolution had provided the conceptual tools for this exploration. Experiments with telegraphy, beginning with Samuel Morse in the 1830s and 1840s, demonstrated that signals could travel across vast distances via invisible wires. By the 1870s, the telegraph had become ubiquitous in cities, linking households, offices, and distant relatives. Telegraph operators developed a finely tuned ear for rhythm, pauses, and subtle variations in clicks, an awareness that primed the public to hear nuance in other, less tangible sounds. It was a small conceptual leap for a society already attuned to the subtle acoustics of creaking floors and whispering walls to imagine that similar transmissions might occur without wires, through the very air surrounding them. Ethereal communication became a popular subject of both study and entertainment. Scientists such as William Crookes experimented with sensitive instruments, hoping to detect traces of invisible currents or forces that might correspond to spiritual phenomena. Mediums, who had long relied on the acoustic idiosyncrasies of the home, creaks, raps, and sighs, began incorporating scientific language and concepts into their practices. Air, ether, and vibration were no longer merely physical phenomena. They became potential conduits for the unseen. Participants in seances were encouraged to imagine that the faintest stir in a curtain or the subtlest change in ambient pressure could carry messages from distant or departed voices. The phonograph, invented by Thomas Edison in 1877, added a new dimension to this exploration. For the first time, sound could be captured and reproduced mechanically, preserving the human voice beyond the temporal constraints of ordinary life. This invention deeply influenced the Victorian imagination, particularly among spiritualists. If a machine could faithfully record a human voice and replay it later, why could not the ether carry messages from the beyond? The phonograph was not merely a technological marvel, it was a philosophical one, a demonstration that presence and perception could be mediated, manipulated, and replayed. Within the dimly lit parlor, the sound of a voice, whether human, mechanical, or imagined, became yet another layer in the complex symphony of domestic life. Telegraphy also contributed to this conceptual blending. The rhythmic tapping of Morse code, its distinctive pauses and pulses, was a language of presence without the physical form. People who spent their lives listening to these signals, operators, clerks, and curious observers, developed an almost mystical appreciation for invisible communication. In the parlor, the soft tap of a foot, the distant creak of a floorboard, or the subtle hum of a gas lamp could be perceived as messages encoded in the house's own acoustical and physical architecture. The mind, primed to decode invisible patterns, could interpret these signals as intentional, meaningful, and even supernatural. Air currents themselves were implicated in these experiences. Victorian houses were drafty by modern standards. Long corridors, high ceilings, and poorly sealed windows allowed air to flow unpredictably. This movement produced faint whistling, the rustle of drapery, and minor variations in pressure that shifted candle flames and created imperceptible vibrations in furniture. Such phenomena, easily measured and described today, were then fertile ground for speculation. Mediums would often direct attention to these small disturbances, interpreting them as signs of spirit presence or ethereal communication. In essence, the house and the air surrounding it became collaborators, transmitting subtle cues to those who listened carefully. Even outside formal seances, the idea of transmission captivated ordinary inhabitants. Families discussed hearing the voices of absent relatives in the parlor or the hallway. Children reported faint sounds at night that adults could neither confirm nor explain. Newspapers and periodicals frequently printed accounts of ghostly voices and inexplicable sounds, many couched in the language of science and experimentation. The overlap between new technologies, telegraph, phonograph, early electricity, and the spiritual imagination made it difficult to distinguish between genuine mechanical phenomena and the projected expectations of the human mind. Air itself became a medium, a carrier of uncertainty and fascination. In addition to sound, light was often considered part of this invisible transmission. gas lamps, electric bulbs, and early arc lighting flickered subtly, responding to drafts, voltage fluctuations, or mechanical imperfections. Shadows moving in the half-light were interpreted as forms transmitted through the ether, visual echoes of presence overlaid on the physical space of the home. The Victorian eye, trained by candlelight and attentiveness to subtle variations, interpreted these effects as deliberate and meaningful. The house, the air, and the imagination were engaged in a continuous interplay, each responding to the others in a complex choreography that often went unnoticed by casual observers but was profoundly experienced by those attuned to its rhythms. In this way, Victorian fascination with transmission of sound, electricity, ether, and spirit transformed the home itself into a laboratory of perception. Ordinary domestic architecture became a network of amplifiers, conduits, and resonators, while the air carried subtle vibrations, fluctuations, and impressions that could be interpreted as messages from distant or unseen sources. The line between mechanical echo and living voice was fluid, blurred by the sensory environment, cultural expectation, and technological novelty. To inhabit such a house was to live in a world in which presence and absence, life and afterlife, sound and silence were in continuous, gentle negotiation. Ultimately, the Victorian house of the late 19th century was both stage and participant in these experiments. It was an instrument of resonance, a participant in ritual, and a laboratory for curiosity. Its walls, floors, and ceilings were not merely inert, they interacted with air, light, and electricity to produce phenomena that the mind readily interpreted as alive, communicative, and at times uncanny. To inhabit such a home was to dwell in a space where the ordinary was always poised on the edge of the extraordinary, where air, ether, and imagination combined to create an environment uniquely suited to mystery, contemplation, and the quiet thrill of the unseen. In the quiet hours of a Victorian home, when lamps were dimmed and the bustle of the day had retreated to distant streets, the house itself seemed to breathe. Its presence was subtle yet undeniable, communicated not through the deliberate actions of its inhabitants but through the lingering traces of decades of use. Creaking floors, peeling wallpaper, faint odors from long extinguished fires, and the very settling of walls collectively conveyed the impression of memory, a domestic consciousness shaped by time, repetition, and human occupancy. In these moments, the home was less a structure of timber and plaster than a repository of life, storing impressions in ways both tangible and elusive. Victorian builders rarely anticipated this dimension of their creations. Floors were laid in oak, pine, or elm, each board cut and fitted with care but subject to the natural contraction, expansion, and warping of wood over time. Footsteps, particularly in high-traffic areas such as hallways and parlors, slowly left their mark not only in physical wear but in subtle acoustical imprints. A board, once stiff and responsive, would gradually bend, its resonance altered by decades of pressure and the shifting weight of those who traversed it. The sound of a step in such a space carried history with it, a creak, a groan, a sigh, each a minor yet enduring record of presence. Walls, too, absorbed memory. Lath and plaster construction, typical of the period, created hollow spaces within which air, sound, and even odors could linger. As plaster dried and cracked, it captured the vibrations of countless conversations, the rhythmic tapping of typewriters or writing desks, and the faint hum of machinery. Wallpaper, often applied in layers over the course of multiple renovations, retained impressions of hands, furniture edges, and the shadow of picture frames. In rooms long vacated or lightly used, these subtle details communicated continuity, the presence of past lives made visible and audible in faint, almost imperceptible ways. Scents, ephemeral and often overlooked, contributed profoundly to the sense of memory. The hearth, once central to the domestic day, left lingering traces of coal smoke and resinous wood. Kitchens, with their cast-iron stoves, stored hints of stewing vegetables, baked bread, and aromatic herbs. Even in rooms where fires no longer burned, these olfactory residues persisted, subtly interacting with the imagination. They reinforced the impression that the home was not inert but alive, a vessel containing the accumulated experiences of all who had lived within its walls. The Victorian imagination, attuned to nuance and ritual, interpreted these residues as signs of presence, echoes of former inhabitants, or markers of domestic continuity. In parallel, the house's hidden spaces, attics, basements, underfloor cavities, acted as repositories for both memory and sound. Dust, detritus, and the occasional forgotten object settled in these spaces, undisturbed for decades. Small vibrations traveled through these hidden cavities, producing the familiar yet unpredictable creaks, groans, and thuds that often startled residents. In a parlor dimly lit by flickering gaslight, these sounds could be interpreted as movement, the house recalling, or perhaps reenacting, the steps and gestures of those long gone. The invisible interplay of material and time lent the home a sense of sentience, a perception of continuity that went far beyond mere decoration or structural function. Victorian writers and theorists often employed the metaphor of the house as a living organism. In architectural manuals and cultural commentary, homes were described as breathing, expanding, and contracting, responsive not only to environmental conditions but to human activity. The warmth of a fire, the pressure of footsteps, the movement of air through drafty windows and corridors were interpreted as evidence of this living quality. Even in the absence of inhabitants, the house carried traces of its own rhythms, the gentle settling of joists at night, the faint hum of water in pipes, and the residual resonance of conversations once held within its walls. These subtle, continuous movements reinforced the impression that the home possessed a kind of quiet consciousness, an enduring memory independent of those who lived there. In addition to physical traces, the psychological resonance of memory shaped perception. The Victorians, preoccupied with mourning and remembrance, often regarded their homes as repositories of familial and personal history. Portraits and photographs, furniture inherited over generations, and ceremonial objects such as mourning rings or hair keepsakes imbued rooms with narrative weight. In combination with the acoustic and material characteristics of the house, these items amplified the sense that the home remembered. Footsteps became the echoes of ancestors, the shifting of a curtain a gesture from the past, and the faint creak of a floorboard, a message preserved in time. The boundary between memory and perception blurred, producing the sensation that the house itself retained consciousness. Even in ordinary domestic routines, memory was reinforced. The act of sweeping a floor, opening a window, or lighting a lamp became a dialogue with history. The creak of a shutter might echo in the mind with the memory of prior seasons. The hiss of the fireplace might resonate with the recollection of winter evenings long past. These small, repeated gestures allowed the occupants to inhabit a space that was simultaneously present and historic, ordinary and extraordinary. In this environment, it was easy to believe that the house remembered not only objects and actions but intentions, moods, and even the emotional weight of its residents. Ultimately, the Victorian home functioned as an intricate archive of domestic life. Every creak, groan, shift, and sigh was a small record of movement, expectation, and emotion. Its floors, walls, ceilings, and hidden spaces absorbed and preserved these traces, producing a subtle, continuous hum of memory that informed the perceptions of those who dwelled within. In this sense, the home became both instrument and witness, a space that recorded, remembered, and communicated the passage of time, reinforcing the impression that life, presence, and even spirit were embedded in its very fabric. The metaphor of the house as a living organism, then, was more than poetic. It described a reality grounded in material experience, a building whose bones, surfaces, and hidden cavities carried the weight of human activity, both mechanical and emotional. In inhabiting such a space, the Victorians lived within a continuum of memory, listening to the subtle symphony of presence, absence, and recall that emanated from every creak, sigh, and whisper of their domestic environment. The house was, in a sense, both alive and remembering, quietly performing its own slow, persistent narrative long after its builders had gone and its first occupants had departed. As decades passed, Victorian homes bore the slow, almost imperceptible weight of time. Industrial soot from the expanding factories of London and other burgeoning cities settled onto every surface, windowsills, mantels and floors, leaving a faint grey film that dulled colour and softened edges. Chimneys, which once carried smoke high into the sky, leaked traces of coal residue into upper rooms and stairwells. Even houses well removed from factories were affected by the pervasive haze of the Industrial Revolution. This accumulation of particulate matter, invisible at first glance but sensed by the touch and smell, contributed to the atmosphere of quiet abandonment that often transformed ordinary rooms into spaces imbued with unintentional mystery. Wallpaper, another marker of domestic life, told its own story. Printed in layers, frequently refreshed to follow fashions of the day, it aged in a slow and uneven manner. Fading from sunlight, curling at corners, peeling at edges, it preserved the imprint of objects long removed, the shadow of a picture frame, the faint indentation of furniture pressed for decades against its surface, even the subtle stains of handling by hands, both gentle and hurried. These changes, barely perceptible yet persistent, suggested the passage of countless moments, producing an impression of the room as something more than inert space. In the quiet of a dimly lit parlour, it was easy for imagination to fill in the gaps, interpreting subtle patterns and shadows as signs of unseen observers. Industrial soot and aging materials combined with the acoustics of the house to produce an almost tactile atmosphere. Floors, warped over decades, responded to even the lightest pressure, carrying a creak or groan that seemed deliberate. Hollowed beams and walls amplified these sounds, carrying them across the house in unexpected directions. A single step in a corridor could echo into multiple rooms, and the faint settling of plaster could resonate as a deliberate movement. In spaces that had become less trafficked, attics, unused parlours, forgotten chambers, the absence of daily activity allowed the ambient sounds of decay to dominate. Silence in such rooms was not the absence of noise, but the prominence of quiet, punctuated by subtle mechanical and natural movements. Dust, moreover, is a silent recorder. In settled layers, it preserved traces of human activity, footprints, scuff marks, even the faint outlines of objects once moved repeatedly. In the Victorian imagination, these traces could be interpreted as evidence of persistent presence. A lightly disturbed area might be read as the movement of a spirit, a lingering visitor, or the echo of a long-past action. Rooms filled with dust became, in effect, repositories of memory, silent witnesses to the lives that had passed through them, and active participants in the subtle interplay of presence and absence that characterized haunted spaces. Neglect and decay also contributed to the perception of sentience. Cracked plaster, sagging floorboards, and curling wallpaper responded unpredictably to environmental changes. Heat from a coal fire, a shift in humidity, or the slight vibration of distant traffic. Each subtle movement, amplified by the architectural resonance of the home, could be interpreted as deliberate or even watchful. The ordinary, unremarkable physics of material degradation was therefore entwined with the extraordinary, resulting in experiences that could be interpreted as ghostly, spectral, or uncanny. Even the smell of decay played a role in shaping perception. The slow oxidation of paint, the musty scent of long-closed windows, and the faint tang of coal residue in the air combined to create a sensory environment in which the home itself seemed alive with the traces of past activity. Victorian occupants, acutely aware of the impermanence of life and the fragility of domestic spaces, often interpreted these subtle cues as manifestations of memory or presence. Silence in such environments was dense and expectant, giving every small creak, sigh, or whisper the weight of intentionality. The interplay of soot, dust, and decay was particularly potent in houses with complex architectural designs. High ceilings, long corridors, and multiple rooms created a layering of acoustic effects. Dust-covered surfaces absorbed certain frequencies while reflecting others, subtly altering the ambient soundscape. A single tap on a floorboard, or the settling of a plastered ceiling, might echo differently depending on the temperature, humidity, or the slight movement of air. These variations contributed to the impression that rooms were responsive, that the very material of the house carried an awareness of activity, presence, or absence. Abandoned or lightly used rooms became stages for these perceptions. Without daily human traffic to mask or overwhelm subtle noises, the natural settling of the house and the movement of air through drafty corridors produced an intricate symphony of creaks, taps, groans, and sighs. Faint shadows, exaggerated by dim light filtering through grimy windows, lent visual reinforcement to auditory cues. The combination of these factors created a space in which the imagination, already trained to detect patterns and signs of life, interpreted the ordinary as extraordinary. The dust, soot, and decay of the house thus became active participants in the ongoing narrative of presence and memory. Ultimately, the slow accumulation of industrial and domestic residue shaped the Victorian experience of home. Houses were never static. They aged, shifted, and whispered in subtle ways, producing an environment in which ordinary materials could suggest consciousness, attention, and presence. Dust was not merely a nuisance, it was a layer of time, a witness to human life, and a medium through which past activity continued to echo. In the quietude of an abandoned parlor or a neglected corridor, the house communicated through the combined languages of sound, scent, texture, and shadow, offering the impression, persistent and gentle, that it was watching, remembering, and alive. In this context, silence became as potent as sound. Rooms devoid of people were never truly empty. They were populated by the slow, inexorable consequences of time and material accumulation. Industrial soot settled over polished surfaces, wallpaper faded and curled, and hidden cavities retained the faint resonance of earlier activity. Together, these elements created a subtle yet persistent impression of presence, the house itself, speaking softly, if not intentionally, to all who listened with care and imagination. By the closing decades of the 19th century, the fascination with ghostly presences in Victorian homes had attracted more than casual attention. Individuals who might have once been dismissed as eccentric enthusiasts, scientists, scholars, and methodical observers began to step through the threshold of these houses with a different purpose: to measure, document, and understand. The Society for Psychical Research (SPR), founded in 1882, emerged as the foremost institutional embodiment of this impulse. Its members, often trained in disciplines ranging from physics to philosophy, approached the phenomena of haunted houses not with superstition alone, but with a careful, skeptical curiosity. They aimed to distinguish between trickery, psychological predisposition, and natural causes, all while navigating the subtle acoustics, architecture, and accumulated memories of these aging homes. Investigators brought with them a variety of tools and methodologies. Thermometers, barometers, and hygrometers measured environmental conditions, fluctuations in temperature, shifts in humidity, and air currents that could influence the behavior of objects and the perception of sound. Early photographic equipment, though cumbersome, captured shadows, reflections, and the faint play of light in rooms dimly illuminated by gas or candle. Detailed notebooks recorded every creak, knock, and flicker, cataloging occurrences with the precision of a laboratory log. Investigators sought to render the subjective objective, to quantify what had previously been the domain of imagination and anecdote. Their entry into a house was deliberate, often conducted with care to preserve the natural patterns of the home. Floors were left undisturbed before observation, furniture remained in situ, and windows were adjusted minimally. This allowed the building to reveal its ordinary behaviors: the subtle groans of timber under minor shifts in temperature, the hum of gas and early electricity, the creaks of floors that had borne decades of footsteps. SPR investigators noted these phenomena systematically, observing how natural causes might produce noises previously attributed to spirits. The meticulousness of this approach lent authority to their findings, even when results were inconclusive. Yet despite their scientific rigor, investigators frequently encountered phenomena that resisted easy categorization. Hollow walls transmitted faint raps and thumps, sometimes in rhythms that suggested intention. Floorboards shifted subtly under no apparent weight, and the high ceilings of parlors allowed echoes to extend across multiple rooms. Investigators noted that ambient conditions, wind, temperature, drafts could amplify these occurrences, producing sounds that seemed purposeful to untrained ears. The house, it appeared, remained a complex and active participant, its ordinary properties magnifying the subjective experience of presence. One of the notable methods employed by SPR investigators was participant observation. Researchers often sat with the residents during seances, documenting responses to subtle environmental changes, while also noting physiological and psychological reactions. The goal was not merely to debunk, but to understand how expectation, fear, and attention shaped perception. For instance, a faint tap in a long corridor might be recorded alongside the moment when a nervous resident turned toward the sound. Over time, patterns emerged. Certain architectural features consistently produced noises interpreted as ghostly, and environmental variables, from humidity to the flow of air, correlated with the timing of disturbances. Through careful documentation, science began to map the house not only as a structure of wood and plaster, but as a system producing perceptible and reproducible phenomena. The SPR and other contemporary investigators also explored the role of mechanical innovation. Gas lighting, early electricity, and plumbing were catalogued as frequent contributors to auditory and visual anomalies. For example, flickering flames in gas lamps could create dancing shadows along walls, amplifying faint floorboard vibrations into perceived footsteps. Electrical buzzes or minor surges produced rhythmic hums that echoed through hollow cavities. The interplay between these technologies and the home's architecture allowed the house itself to act as an amplifier, conveying otherwise subtle events with exaggerated effect. Observers recognized that the combination of novelty and ambient noise heightened susceptibility to misinterpretation, a key factor in reports of hauntings. Importantly, scientific investigation did not erase the cultural and psychological layers embedded in the home. While thermometers and notebooks provided objective data, the residents' histories, grief, and attentiveness to subtle signals remained critical in shaping experiences. Victorian houses, already laden with memory, soot, and decay, produced sensory inputs that were interpreted differently depending on expectation and familiarity. Investigators were keenly aware that the human mind could project narrative onto mechanical events, and that even the most careful measurement might not capture the subjective resonance of a room. Houses, in essence, retained an agency of perception that was as much psychological as physical. Despite occasional skepticism, SPR reports acknowledged the profound effect of environment on perception. Long corridors, hollow walls, high ceilings, and drafts all played roles in producing sounds and impressions that residents genuinely experienced as supernatural. Observers emphasized that understanding these variables did not diminish the intensity of the phenomena for those who lived within them. Rather, it contextualized the home as an intricate system in which sound, light, architecture, and memory interacted. The Victorian house was both cause and medium, a laboratory of perception in which ordinary materials and mechanical properties could produce extraordinary effects. The presence of investigators also altered the rhythm of domestic life. Families often adapted their routines in response to observation, noting which rooms seemed most active, which hours produced the clearest phenomena, and how environmental changes influenced perception. This collaboration between science and domestic experience created a feedback loop. The home, in its natural behaviors, reinforced observation, while observation amplified the perceived strangeness of the house. Over time, these systematic studies laid the groundwork for a deeper understanding of how architecture, materials, and human expectation intersected to produce the uncanny, without necessarily invoking spirits. In conclusion, the late Victorian scientific investigations brought a measure of method and order to a world often dominated by anecdote and imagination. Investigators like those of the SPR walked through doorways into homes imbued with decades of sound, memory, and subtle movement, seeking to discern the natural from the supernatural. Their meticulous observations revealed the ways in which architecture, environment, and human perception converged, producing phenomena that could be quantified, documented, and occasionally explained. Yet the houses themselves, with their floors, walls, and hidden cavities, continued to shape experience in subtle, often unpredictable ways. In their quiet persistence, these homes remained alive, whispering through the layers of time, material, and imagination, even in the presence of science. In the intricate domestic landscapes of late Victorian homes, the unseen currents of air played a role as pervasive and persistent as any resident or visitor. While floors creaked, pipes hissed, and walls groaned with age, the atmosphere itself carried whispers of presence, not through supernatural agency, but through the subtle mechanics of physics. Investigators, from members of the Society for Psychical Research to curious amateur scientists, began to recognize that drafts, pressure fluctuations, and resonant vibrations could produce sensations long attributed to ghosts. In doing so, they revealed a world in which the ordinary behavior of air and matter created quiet, compelling illusions of sentience and watchfulness. Drafts, nearly imperceptible to the casual observer, were ubiquitous in Victorian homes. Long corridors, tall ceilings, sash windows that did not fit perfectly, and hidden gaps in walls allowed air to flow unpredictably. On calm nights, even a minimal difference in pressure between rooms could cause doors to move slightly, curtains to flutter, or gas flames to dance. Each subtle motion, amplified by dim lighting and attentive imagination, could be interpreted as a deliberate act, a whispering presence passing through the hall, a spirit brushing past the furniture, or a hand tracing along a wall. Observers often described these phenomena with a mixture of fear and fascination, unaware that physics, not phantoms, produced the effects. Pressure changes, too, were capable of remarkable influence. Weather shifts, wind across chimneys, or the differential expansion and contraction of timber could generate minute vibrations in floors and walls. These vibrations, transmitted through the dense timber and hollow lath and plaster walls, often manifested as faint tapping, groaning, or thumping. The human ear, conditioned to detect pattern and meaning in ambiguity, interpreted these vibrations as messages or footsteps. Victorian residents, attuned to the subtleties of domestic sound, were naturally predisposed to perceive intention where only physical resonance occurred. Resonance itself was a quiet, almost musical contributor to the uncanny. Hollow floors, long corridors, and expansive rooms created natural echo chambers in which sound waves could linger, overlap, and amplify. A single creak, a footstep on a distant stair, or the shifting of a chair could produce reverberations that seemed to travel independently of their source. These resonances were particularly effective in producing the sense of presence, a sound that returned with altered timing, a pitch slightly changed, or a vibration echoed across a space seemed to carry deliberate intention. The architecture, in effect, participated in its own haunting, performing a quiet symphony of perception that merged the real and the imagined. Victorian investigators often demonstrated the curious serenity of rational explanation. Experiments were conducted in controlled settings to replicate reported ghostly phenomena. A door was left ajar in a corridor. A slight draft produced a rhythmic tapping reminiscent of a moving figure. A shift in air pressure across a basement window caused a floorboard to groan, precisely mimicking the timing described by anxious occupants. Investigators could recreate the sensory experience of the haunted house without invoking spirits, revealing that the source of many reported phenomena lay in air and material dynamics rather than spectral intervention. Yet the demonstrations were conducted with a deliberate calm, emphasizing observation and understanding rather than fear or sensationalism. Even in well-occupied homes, the behavior of air maintained its subtle influence. Occupants moving from one room to another altered airflow, producing faint whistling, shifting curtains, or minor vibrations in furniture. Gas lamps, responding to these microcurrents, flickered unpredictably, casting dancing shadows that the mind interpreted as movement. The interplay of visual and auditory cues reinforced the sense that the home was aware, responsive, and subtly alive. Here, rational explanation did not remove the sensation of presence. It refined it, offering a framework through which residents could understand without dismissing their own experience. Beyond individual perception, these principles explain why some rooms seemed consistently haunted while others remained quiet. Rooms with high ceilings, long corridors, and hollow underfloor spaces amplified the effects of air movement and pressure changes. Conversely, smaller rooms or those with more solid construction absorbed or diffused these subtle forces, producing fewer perceptible effects. This variation gave rise to patterns of haunting. Certain parlors, attics, or stairwells became loci of persistent activity, a pattern entirely consistent with physics yet interpreted by many as evidence of spirit presence. The house, in essence, choreographed its own quiet phenomena through the behavior of its invisible medium, air. The beauty of these explanations lies in their subtlety. Unlike dramatic crashes or overt disturbances, the ghosts of air worked through nuance and continuity. A faint thump in a distant hallway, a whisper-like vibration in a floorboard, the gentle sway of a curtain, and the flicker of a candle flame all combined to produce a holistic experience of presence. In contrast to overt trickery or deliberate mechanical devices, these effects were unassuming, continuous, and often imperceptible except to those who listened carefully. The serenity of rational explanation did not demand spectacle. It revealed the wonder inherent in ordinary forces made extraordinary only by attention and imagination. Furthermore, air-mediated phenomena reinforced the impression that the house itself was alive, remembering and responsive. Just as dust, decay, and acoustics communicated memory, so too did invisible currents provide continuous feedback. A door moved by a draft echoed footsteps, a floorboard vibrated as if under pressure, a flame danced as if acknowledging the room's history. These ordinary processes, combined with expectation and perception, created experiences indistinguishable from the supernatural to all but the most skeptical observer. The house remained a living organism, its breath subtle yet persistent, its presence inscribed in the very medium that surrounded its occupants. Ultimately, the ghosts that were air demonstrated the quiet sophistication of Victorian domestic experience. Scientific inquiry revealed that what many feared as spectral intervention could be accounted for by natural forces, yet it did so without diminishing the aesthetic or emotional resonance of the phenomena. Air, drafts, pressure, and resonance became partners in a delicate dance with perception, shaping the lived experience of the house while preserving its mystery. The unseen currents, moving silently through walls, floors, and corridors, continued to whisper, reminding inhabitants that the ordinary could appear extraordinary when observed with attentiveness, imagination, and a touch of reverence. Victorian architects and builders, driven by aesthetics, utility, and social expectation, seldom intended to cultivate an atmosphere of mystery within the homes they designed. Yet, as the decades passed and the subtle interplay of structure, material, and perception revealed itself, it became evident that many design choices, whether made for beauty, convenience, or economy, unintentionally fostered an environment rich with potential for the uncanny. Hidden vents, hollow attics, echoing staircases, and long, narrow corridors all contributed to a sensory environment that amplified sound, light, and shadow in ways that could suggest sentience, presence, or even spectral intervention. At the core of these architectural effects was the Victorian desire for scale and grandeur. Parlors with high ceilings, expansive drawing rooms, and elongated corridors were designed to impress, to signify status and refinement. These features, however, also altered the movement of sound and air. A footstep at one end of a long corridor could echo multiple times, bouncing off plastered walls, wooden panels, and glass surfaces, creating a rhythm and resonance that suggested intent. The very materials chosen for beauty, Polished hardwood floors, intricately carved banisters, and glass-paneled doors became instruments of subtle acoustical manipulation, whether consciously intended or not. Hollow attics, often included for storage or to conceal structural elements, were particularly influential. Lath and plaster ceilings created pockets of empty space that could amplify ambient noises, transforming the minor settling of timber into resonant creaks that traveled throughout the house. These attics, often visited infrequently, became repositories for dust, soot, and ambient echoes, creating soundscapes that could be interpreted as footsteps, whispers, or movement. In dimly lit spaces, light filtering through small windows produced shifting shadows that interacted with these sounds, enhancing the perception of life and awareness within the home. Staircases, another staple of Victorian design, contributed in both structural and symbolic ways. Grand, sweeping staircases or narrow service stairs tucked into corners provided channels for sound to travel vertically between floors. The natural amplification along stairwells allowed footsteps, small thuds, or the subtle movement of furniture to resonate throughout the house. Even when unoccupied, these passages conducted vibrations in ways that seemed purposeful, creating the impression of activity or presence. The architecture itself, therefore, acted as a medium, transforming mundane mechanical events into perceived interactions with the supernatural. Hidden vents and service passages, often implemented for heating, ventilation, or gas piping, also played a critical role. These small channels, connecting rooms and corridors, conducted both sound and air, transmitting subtle vibrations and whispers from one area to another. Residents and observers, untrained in the physics of resonance and airflow, frequently interpreted these transmissions as evidence of invisible movement or deliberate communication. The very infrastructure designed to support domestic comfort and functionality, when combined with the sensitivity of human perception, became a contributor to mystery and uncanny sensation. In addition to structural design, decorative elements subtly influenced perception. Molding, wainscoting, and paneling created surfaces that reflected sound unevenly, producing minor echoes or tonal variations. Patterned wallpaper and textured plaster, interacting with light, created shifting visual patterns that could suggest movement or shape. Chandeliers and lamps, suspended from high ceilings, cast elongated shadows that changed with the flicker of gas flames or early electric bulbs. Together, these design elements established a layered sensory environment in which the ordinary became extraordinary, and aesthetic beauty seamlessly intertwined with the potential for eeriness. Builders' attention to ornamentation, intended to impress and signify refinement, also contributed to the atmosphere of uncertainty. Carved wooden banisters, detailed cornices, and decorative archways created irregular surfaces that interacted unpredictably with both light and sound. Small variations in construction, a slightly loose floorboard, a hidden cavity behind paneling, amplified vibrations or allowed minor air currents to create motion. These subtle structural features, imperceptible in isolation, collectively produced a dynamic environment in which human perception could interpret ordinary mechanical or natural phenomena as deliberate, sentient, or supernatural. The interplay between light, material, and perception was further magnified by the technological context of the time. Gas lamps and early electricity cast irregular, flickering illumination, accentuating shadows and highlighting texture. In combination with the architectural acoustics, these lighting conditions transformed everyday sounds and movements into experiences that felt intentional. A footstep, a shifting curtain, or a settling board could be perceived as the interaction of presence with environment, rather than the ordinary consequence of physics or daily use. Architecture, in its ambition and detail, had inadvertently become a collaborator in the creation of domestic mystery. Moreover, the psychological context of Victorian inhabitants amplified the effect. In homes where spiritualism, mourning, and memory were culturally prominent, the ordinary noises and visual cues created by design were interpreted through a lens of expectation and attentiveness. Hollow stairwells echoed footsteps that were perceived as approaching or departing spirits. High ceilings allowed subtle temperature changes to produce gentle drafts, moving curtains in patterns that suggested intentionality. The residents' focus on these cues transformed architectural idiosyncrasies into experiences of uncanny awareness, reinforcing the perception that the house was a living participant in daily life. In essence, Victorian architects and builders, in pursuit of grandeur, comfort, and aesthetic coherence, unwittingly designed for mystery. Their choices, high ceilings, hollow attics, echoing staircases, hidden vents, and textured surfaces, created conditions in which sound, light, and air interacted to produce subtle, continuous, and often unpredictable sensory experiences. Beauty and eeriness, far from being mutually exclusive, occupied the same space, arising from the same careful craftsmanship that defined Victorian domestic architecture. The result was a home that was simultaneously functional, elegant, and capable of producing the profound impression of presence, memory, and quiet wonder. The house, shaped by its creator's hands and intentions, became a vessel for perception, imagination, and memory. In its silent corridors, resonant stairwells, and shadowed attics, the ordinary transformed into the extraordinary. Residents, visitors, and later investigators experienced these environments not merely as dwellings, but as spaces alive with subtle motion, sound, and light. Architecture, through its combination of artistry and practicality, had unwittingly produced a medium through which mystery could flow, allowing ordinary homes to harbor the extraordinary quietly, persistently, and beautifully. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over streets still dusted with soot and fog, the Victorian home entered a phase distinct from the rhythms of daytime. Life after sundown was marked by subdued illumination, gentle domestic rituals, and a pervasive, almost tangible quiet that contrasted with the industrial and social bustle of daylight hours. Gas lamps flickered in parlors and hallways, their wavering flames casting uneven patterns across walls, floors, and furniture. Coal stoves, having worked steadily throughout the day, began to settle, releasing faint hisses, creaks, and groans as metal contracted and embers cooled. The combination of diminishing light, cooling surfaces, and the hushed attentiveness of evening inhabitants transformed ordinary domestic spaces into environments rich with subtle, often uncanny perception. In these long, dim evenings, the house itself seemed more alive. Every element, floorboards, staircases, radiators, and pipes, became increasingly perceptible as auditory and visual phenomena. The soft creak of a joist under an absent footstep, the faint groan of a settling beam, or the gentle flicker of a gas flame produced complex, layered cues that interacted with the imagination. Shadows moved imperceptibly across textured wallpaper or along carved molding, influenced both by flame and by the observer's own shifting gaze. The home, in effect, became a participant in its own narrative, its ambient behaviors magnified in perception by the evening's subdued sensory conditions. The extended hours of darkness and quiet heightened attentiveness. Residents, accustomed to the hum and activity of daytime, were now confronted with environments in which every sound carried potential significance. Distant footsteps on a stair, the minor rumble of a radiator as it cooled, or a curtain brushing a sill could be interpreted as deliberate movement rather than natural consequence. This hyper-awareness, combined with a cultural focus on memory, mourning, and spiritualism, created an environment in which ordinary sounds were easily anthropomorphized or imbued with supernatural meaning. Night amplified not only perception but expectation, making the familiar strange and the mundane suggestive. Gas lighting itself played a significant role in shaping these nocturnal experiences. Flames, inherently unstable, responded to drafts, minor pressure shifts, and temperature changes, producing subtle flickering or elongation of shadows. These variations, projected across patterned wallpaper, carved wood, and textured surfaces, created shapes and forms that were dynamic and unpredictable. In low light, the human mind naturally sought patterns and meaning, interpreting shifting shadows as movement, gesture, or presence. Even when fully rational, observers found themselves responding emotionally and physically to visual cues that in daylight would have been imperceptible or dismissed. Coal stoves, central to domestic warmth and activity, contributed their own dimension to the nocturnal atmosphere. As fires cooled, metal components contracted, producing a rhythmic series of cracks, pops, and low groans. Heat rising unevenly through radiators or pipes added a faint hum or whistle to the acoustic environment. These subtle mechanical noises, amplified in large rooms with high ceilings and reflective surfaces, were often interpreted as signaling movement elsewhere in the house. The house's ordinary thermal and mechanical processes became part of a quiet, continuous orchestra that coincided with periods of heightened attentiveness during evening hours. Night also emphasized the spatial characteristics of Victorian homes. Long corridors, often unlit except for a distant gas flame, allowed sound to travel in ways that were imperceptible during daylight activity. Hollow stairwells transmitted vibrations from one floor to another, producing echoes and resonances that could seem deliberate or rhythmic. Rooms connected by open doorways or archways experienced subtle pressure and air shifts that moved curtains, doors, and even furniture slightly. In these moments, the house could seem responsive, aware, and almost sentient, engaging inhabitants in a dialogue conducted through sound, shadow, and ambient motion. The psychological effects of night were equally profound. Cultural preoccupations with death, memory, and the supernatural primed inhabitants to interpret ordinary nocturnal phenomena as meaningful. Mourning rituals, family photographs, and commemorative objects were often located in parlors or hallways where light was dim, shadow deep, and ambient sound amplified. In such settings, the ordinary sounds and movements of the house, creaking floors, settling beams, flickering lamps, became intertwined with emotional and mnemonic associations, enhancing the perception of presence or observation. Night transformed the home from a space of practical activity into an environment saturated with layered sensory and emotional resonance. Furthermore, seasonal and environmental factors accentuated these experiences. Winter evenings, long and dark, combined with dense indoor coal smoke and drafts to produce particularly rich acoustic and visual conditions. Fog and mist, often penetrating poorly sealed windows, muted external noise and subtly refracted light, enhancing both the sensory isolation and internal perceptibility of subtle cues. Even on calm nights, minute shifts in air temperature or pressure could produce small movements, creaks, or hisses that seemed amplified in the attentive, dimly lit interior. The Victorian night, therefore, was not merely the absence of daylight but a carefully structured sensory environment that shaped perception and expectation. In essence, the nocturnal experience of the Victorian home heightened the interplay of architecture, materiality, and imagination. Shadows elongated, sounds traveled unpredictably, and subtle motions became noticeable and meaningful. Occupants, attuned by cultural, psychological, and environmental factors, found that the ordinary operations of the home, creaks, hisses, flickers, and drafts, could produce an almost constant sense of watchfulness and presence. The quiet, dimly illuminated house after sundown offered a setting in which the familiar became mysterious, and the mundane resonated with subtle intrigue and gentle unease. Thus, the Victorian night was both ordinary and extraordinary, a time when the rhythms of domestic life intersected with environmental, architectural, and cultural forces to produce a uniquely perceptive experience. In these hours, the home's subtle symphony of sound and shadow could be fully appreciated, its quiet complexity noticed, and its uncanny potential realized. Night shaped superstition not through spectacle, but through the gentle, continuous amplification of the house's ordinary behaviors, offering inhabitants a calm yet persistent sense that their surroundings were attentive, responsive, and alive with history and memory. Within the Victorian home, where craftsmanship and design intersected with social expectation and aesthetic ambition, visual cues played a profound role in shaping perception. Symmetry, mirrors, and shadow created a subtle yet persistent sense that the house was not simply a passive container of life, but an active observer, capable of registering presence, motion, and intent. This impression, though entirely psychological, was intensified by the careful architectural composition characteristic of the era: long corridors punctuated by aligned doorways, parlors mirrored in reflection, and staircases framed to draw the eye along specific axes. In this interplay of structure and perception, ordinary rooms could evoke the uncanny sensation that they were aware, watching, and responsive. Symmetry, a hallmark of Victorian design, contributed more than aesthetic balance. Hallways, staircases, and parlors were often arranged so that patterns of doors, windows, and furniture repeated rhythmically across the space. The human visual system, finely tuned to detect order and predictability, simultaneously noted deviations from these patterns: a slightly ajar door, a shadow misaligned with a sconce, a curtain flickering with the slightest draft. The mind, seeking coherence, interpreted these deviations as movement or intentionality, creating the impression that the house itself was monitoring activity. What was in fact the result of light, geometry, and architectural composition was perceived as deliberate responsiveness, an illusion of awareness embedded within design. Mirrors amplified this effect, reflecting both light and motion in ways that subtly altered perception. Often placed strategically within parlors, staircases, or hallways, mirrors multiplied perspectives, extending sightlines and creating the potential for faint, shifting images to appear unexpectedly. A candle's flicker, or a gas flame's irregular motion could cast shadows and reflections that seemed animated, as if responding to the movement of the observer. Mirrors also reflected portions of the room not directly visible, giving the impression of continuous occupancy or movement, even in spaces momentarily uninhabited. In this way, a home could be experienced as observing itself, with reflective surfaces acting as intermediaries between human perception and architectural space. Shadow, likewise, played a critical role in shaping the uncanny environment. The interplay of gaslight, flickering flames, and early electric lamps with carved moldings, textured wallpaper, and polished wood created patterns of light and dark that shifted subtly over time. Even minor changes, a passing cloud outside, a shifting draft, or the movement of an occupant, altered the geometry of shadows. The Victorian eye, conditioned by cultural attention to detail and expectation of unseen presence, frequently interpreted these variations as movement, presence, or intention. Long, dimly lit corridors became visual stages in which shadows performed gently, continuously, and unpredictably, producing a quiet sensation that the house was both observing and participating. Psychologically, this effect was reinforced by the phenomenon of pareidolia, the tendency of the human brain to perceive familiar forms in random or ambiguous stimuli. Patterns in wallpaper, the interplay of light on textured plaster, or the reflected shapes in mirrors could suggest faces, figures, or gestures. Combined with the low light conditions of evening and the attentive quiet of a dimly occupied home, these subtle cues were often experienced as quasi-conscious presence. The ordinary, repetitive features of design, symmetry, alignment, reflection, became active participants in perception, shaping a continuous, low-grade sensation of observation. Moreover, the Victorian emphasis on formality and order in domestic spaces heightened sensitivity to visual anomalies. Parlors arranged with precise symmetry, staircases framed with decorative newel posts, and hallways lined with portraiture established visual expectations. Deviations from these expectations, however minor, attracted attention and were imbued with significance. A curtain slightly misaligned, the flicker of a shadow across polished floors, or the reflection of a distant object in a mirror could appear animated, directed, and responsive. The house, in effect, seemed to watch itself through the orchestration of form and light, creating the impression of agency without requiring actual movement or consciousness. The layering of visual and auditory cues further reinforced this sense. As residents navigated hallways or sat in parlors, the faint sounds of creaking floorboards, settling timbers, or distant water movement coincided with shadows and reflections. The mind integrated these simultaneous sensory streams into a coherent narrative of presence. The floor groaned where a shadow seemed to pass, a mirror reflected a flicker just as a curtain shifted, and the house, attentive and alive, appeared to respond. Ordinary environmental variables, air currents, material resonance, light fluctuations combined seamlessly with architectural composition to produce a subtle, continuous impression of awareness. Even in unoccupied rooms, these visual mechanisms preserved their effect. Mirrors retained reflections of light and shadow, patterned wallpaper captured and fractured illumination, and symmetrical corridors created depth and alignment that invited perception of activity. The house, through its design, perpetuated an illusion of observation independent of immediate human presence. This sustained the psychological impression of an attentive, responsive environment, a space in which the ordinary, carefully composed elements of architecture and decoration collaborated to create a low, persistent hum of uncanny awareness. Ultimately, Victorian houses watching themselves illustrates the interplay of perception, architecture, and psychology. Symmetry, mirrors and shadow combined with ambient light, environmental variables, and human attentiveness produced subtle experiences of presence and observation. The effect was neither deliberate nor supernatural, rather it emerged naturally from the intersection of design, sensory perception, and expectation. Yet for inhabitants the impression was undeniable, a quiet, persistent sensation that the house, in its forms and reflections, was aware, responsive, and gently observing the passage of life within its walls. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the familiar sounds of Victorian homes, the constant settling of timber, the rhythmic groan of floorboards, the hiss of gas pipes, and the faint whistles of coal stoves, began a slow, almost imperceptible retreat. Industrial advances, architectural evolution, and the introduction of modern materials and utilities altered the sensory landscape, replacing the rich, echoing chorus of the past with quieter, more uniform domestic rhythms. The houses themselves, once vibrant with creaks, groans, and whispering drafts, became increasingly subdued, their ghostly orchestra fading into the softer hum of early modernity. One of the primary agents of change was the introduction of electric lighting. Unlike gas lamps, which flickered unpredictably, cast elongated shadows, and responded subtly to drafts, early electric bulbs produced steadier illumination, reducing the dynamic interplay of light and shadow that had so often contributed to the perception of movement and presence. Rooms previously animated by the wavering glow of gas were now filled with a consistent, gentle light that flattened shadows, softened contrasts, and diminished the visual cues upon which the imagination had relied. In this environment, subtle reflections in mirrors, dancing highlights on polished wood, and the shifting glow on patterned wallpaper no longer created the same impression of activity or sentience. Plumbing and heating systems also underwent transformation, gradually replacing noisy, hissing gas lines and coal stoves with quieter alternatives. Early hot water radiators, improved copper pipes, and standardized plumbing fixtures minimized creaks, pops, and leaks that had once filled hallways and parlors with sound. Bathrooms and kitchens, increasingly isolated by new layouts and insulated walls, no longer transmitted echoes and vibrations into the broader house. The ambient symphony that had provided an invisible, constant companion to human activity was gradually diminished. Rooms that once seemed to breathe and respond now maintained a quiet uniformity, their subtle voices muted by technology and design. Building materials, too, reflected changing priorities. Plaster and lath were increasingly replaced with drywall. Hollow wooden beams gave way to steel and reinforced frameworks, and insulating techniques reduced the transmission of both sound and air currents. Floors, walls, and ceilings that had previously amplified minor movements now absorbed them. Corridors and parlors lost their echoing qualities, and attics, once repositories for dust, soot, and subtle resonance, were repurposed or sealed. Homes became more efficient, quieter, and safer, yet the intimate connection between structure and perception, that network through which subtle creaks, groans, and drafts communicated a sense of presence, receded almost imperceptibly. This slow fading of auditory and visual cues coincided with broader cultural changes. Spiritualism, while still practiced, was no longer as central to daily life, and scientific skepticism had become more widespread. The intersection of psychology, architecture, and domestic acoustics, once mysterious and compelling, became subject to rational explanation. The uncanny phenomena that had enlivened corridors and attics were now often understood as relics of material properties, environmental conditions, and attentive imagination. What remained was the narrative, the story of voices and movements that had once been heard rather than the phenomena themselves. Yet the human memory of these spaces remained vivid. Formerly vibrant homes, now quiet under electric light and insulated walls, carried with them an aura of nostalgia. The echoes of creaking floors, rattling pipes, and flickering lamps persisted in recollection, even as the tangible sensory experiences diminished. Families passing through older homes spoke of rooms that once seemed alive, of attics that whispered, and of shadows that moved with intention. The fading voices of the house became a bridge between past and present, linking memory, imagination, and historical experience in a gentle, continuous reverie. Interestingly, the quieting of homes did not entirely eliminate the sense of presence, it transformed it. With fewer auditory distractions, the imagination filled the gaps with narrative, memory, and suggestion. A subtle vibration underfoot, the soft settling of a wall, or a faint draft through a slightly open window could evoke memories of the fuller, more expressive acoustic environment of previous decades. The home, though quieter, retained its capacity to evoke reflection, nostalgia, and even a mild sense of uncanny awareness. Its personality, once communicated through creaks, groans, and shadows, was now encoded in absence, the silence itself carrying a gentle echo of its former voice. The transition from the Victorian to the Edwardian period illustrates the complex interplay of technology, materials, and perception. Homes that had once seemed animated and attentive became quieter and more uniform, reflecting broader societal and technological shifts. Electric lighting, modern plumbing, improved construction methods, and architectural simplification all contributed to the fading of the house's sonic and visual signature. Yet the narrative persisted, and memory transformed the quiet into a canvas upon which the imagination could reconstruct the voices and movements that once defined the domestic experience. Ultimately, the slow fading of voices represents both a historical and sensory evolution. The ordinary sounds of domestic life, once magnified by architectural design and environmental conditions into experiences of uncanny presence, gradually diminished under the influence of modernity. What remained was a delicate, almost imperceptible layer of memory, reflection, and storytelling. The Victorian house, once alive with subtle motion, sound, and light, now spoke primarily through recollection, preserving its character in the minds of those who remembered, visited, or studied it. Even in silence, the house continued to exist as a repository of presence, now encoded in history, memory, and imagination, rather than creak or whisper. As the 19th century gave way to the innovations of early photographic technology, a new medium emerged through which the Victorian fascination with presence, memory, and the unseen could be expressed. Photography, still in its relative infancy, allowed families and observers to capture moments of domestic life, social gatherings, and personal history. Yet, even as the medium developed technically, it also created opportunities for the imagination to wander, for subtle imperfections in the process to be interpreted as spectral traces, and for the house's memory to be encoded in visual form. The process of early photography, whether daguerreotype, ambrotype, or tintype, was inherently slow and delicate. Exposure times required subjects to remain still for several seconds, sometimes minutes, during which even minor movements could create faint blurs or ghosted outlines. A servant shifting slightly, a curtain fluttering in a draught, or a candle flame reflecting in polished surfaces could produce unexpected streaks or partial transparency. For Victorian observers attuned to subtle signs of presence in their environment, these accidental effects were often read not merely as technical anomalies but as evidence of lingering spirits, residual energy, or conscious awareness of the space. Double exposures. a common occurrence in early photography due to the complexities of chemical processing and camera handling, further contributed to the spectral imagination. A single negative might contain faint echoes of a figure from a previous session, producing an apparition-like effect that seemed to hover above the primary image. Portraits of deceased relatives, sometimes deliberately combined with living family members, offered a tangible connection between memory and the present, reinforcing the cultural desire to see continuity beyond death. These images were not only documentation but narrative visualizations of longing, mourning, and the ongoing conversation between life and absence. Victorian houses themselves contributed subtly to these photographic effects. Dimly lit interiors, rich in shadows and reflections, interacted with the limitations of early photographic equipment to produce areas of overexposure, underexposure, and soft focus. Mirrors, polished furniture, and textured wallpapers all created diffuse reflections that could appear as forms or gestures within the frame. Stairs, high ceilings, and long corridors, when photographed under limited light, emphasized perspective and depth, making faint anomalies appear more significant than they might in direct observation. In this sense, the house's architecture and materiality became collaborators in the creation of spectral images, extending the sensory environment into the medium of photography. The Victorian fascination with spirit photography, popularized in the 1870s and 1880s, formalized this intersection between observation, technology, and imagination. Photographers such as William H. Mumler and others capitalized on the cultural appetite for tangible evidence of the unseen, producing images in which faint, ghost-like figures appeared alongside living subjects. While some methods were deliberate deceptions, others were products of the medium's technical limitations, environmental lighting, and human attentiveness. For observers, however, the distinction was less critical than the visual affirmation that the house, the family, and memory itself could be reflected, twice seen or partially present in another form. These photographic phenomena illustrate a deeper Victorian yearning, the desire to see continuity in the unseen to make perceptible the imperceptible. Even as science advanced, documenting, measuring, and explaining the natural world, the imagination sought connections beyond empirical observation. Ghosts in photographs were, therefore, extensions of the same perceptual tendencies that had once interpreted creaks, hisses, and shadows as active presence. The medium of photography offered a visual analog to the auditory and spatial cues embedded in the house, preserving a sense of life and interaction even as the original phenomena faded with technological and structural changes. Moreover, photography reinforced the persistence of memory within the domestic space. Portraits, group photographs, and images of parlors and corridors captured the arrangement of furniture, the play of light, and the composition of rooms. Even after alterations to the house or modernization of utilities, these images preserved the atmosphere of presence, the reflections, shadows, and textures that had once contributed to the perception of life within the home. In this way, the medium became both a record and an extension of the house's own quiet voice, allowing observers to encounter echoes of presence long after the sounds themselves had diminished. The interplay of technical imperfection, environmental conditions, and human expectation ensured that photographs continued the Victorian conversation with the unseen. Blurs, reflections, and double exposures functioned as modern analogues to creaking floorboards, shifting curtains, and flickering lights. Even in the absence of auditory cues, the visual record maintained the same narrative tension, the ordinary rendered extraordinary, the mundane suffused with presence, and the home as both stage and actor in a quiet drama of observation and memory. Photography, therefore, was not merely documentation but an immersive continuation of the uncanny experience embedded within the Victorian domestic environment. Ultimately, Ghosts in Photographs demonstrates the persistence of presence in a medium transformed by technology. While the houses themselves grew quieter and less acoustically expressive, the visual evidence preserved the layered, attentive experience of inhabitants. Light, shadow, reflection, and the technical idiosyncrasies of early photography created forms that mirrored the perceptual tendencies of their observers. The Victorian longing to see the unseen, to perceive, remember, and connect with what was absent, endured, extending the house's quiet symphony into the new realm of image and optics, where memory, imagination, and technology converged in a subtle, persistent echo of life and presence. As the 20th century unfolded and urban landscapes evolved, many Victorian homes, once vibrant with the quiet symphony of domestic life, were gradually abandoned. Industrial expansion, suburban migration, and shifting social patterns led families to vacate long-standing residences, leaving corridors, parlors, attics, and basements to the passage of time and the slow encroachment of nature. In these empty homes, the absence of human activity did not erase presence, instead it transformed it. The same mechanisms, creaking wood, shifting plaster, flickering shadows, and subtle air currents, persisted, now amplified by neglect, decay, and silence, giving rise to an eerie, reflective environment that both memorialized and animated the architecture itself. Wind, one of the most persistent forces acting on abandoned structures, played a central role in the acoustic life of empty houses. Drafts moved through gaps in windows, warped doors, and cracks in walls, producing soft whistles, hisses, and thumps. Attics, once repositories of storage and the occasional curious visitor, became resonant chambers in which even minor pressure changes generated echoes that traveled through floors and staircases. Long corridors, stripped of furnishings and softened by dust-laden air, conducted these sounds with a clarity and persistence absent when rooms were occupied. The empty house, through interaction with wind and air, became a subtle instrument, echoing the phenomena that had once filled it with human and imagined life. Rot and decay introduced their own contributions to the house's lingering symphony. Wooden beams, floors, and banisters warped and groaned as moisture penetrated the structure. Plaster walls cracked, sometimes separating from lath, producing gentle rhythmic vibrations when pressure shifted within the building. Roof timbers sagged, floorboards expanded and contracted unevenly, and doors, no longer reinforced by frequent handling, moved slightly under their own weight. These changes, while slow and gradual, recreated the same creaks, groans, and sighs that had previously been associated with human presence or spectral activity. The house, in a sense, remembered its former life through the physics of decay, transmitting the memory of motion and sound in ways that were tangible, subtle, and continuous. Even in the absence of light sources, the play of shadow persisted, transformed by the infiltration of sunlight through broken windows or gaps in siding. Dust motes suspended in beams of sunlight created dynamic patterns that shifted imperceptibly over hours. Wallpaper, faded and peeling, cast faint textures across walls that altered as sunlight moved, suggesting forms and movements reminiscent of human activity. Mirrors, often tarnished or fractured, reflected fragments of the environment in ways that intensified the perception of presence. The interplay of natural illumination, shadow, and reflective surfaces perpetuated a visual echo of domestic life, giving the impression that the house continued to observe and respond even when uninhabited. The emotional resonance of empty homes was heightened by their historical and cultural context. Former inhabitants, aware of the history embedded within walls, floors, and furniture, often projected memory and imagination onto the decaying structure. Stories of past activity, lingering family presence, or ghostly visitations became intertwined with the observable phenomena of wind, decay, and light. The physical architecture acted as both medium and repository, preserving traces of prior life while providing the sensory cues that allowed new observers to experience continuity of presence. The empty house, though devoid of people, remained alive in perception and memory. Abandoned Victorian homes also demonstrated the resilience of architectural memory. Spatial configurations, long corridors, high ceilings, hollow staircases, and attics continued to shape sound, light, and airflow. Materials such as wood, plaster and metal retained the capacity to expand, contract, resonate, and reflect. Even subtle mechanical properties, like the settling of a roof truss or the soft twisting of a warped floorboard, generated perceptible cues reminiscent of the home's active days. Architecture, in this sense, functioned as a medium for temporal continuity, encoding both human activity and the echoes of prior domestic life within its physical structure. The sensory experience of these empty houses, though devoid of contemporary habitation, mirrored the phenomena that had characterized fully occupied Victorian homes. Creaks and groans occurred without footsteps, flickering shadows existed without the movement of curtains or gas flames, echoes and vibrations persisted absent human interaction. Observers entering such spaces often reported the same subtle sensations of attention, presence, and memory that had been documented in active homes decades earlier. The architecture itself, through its enduring physical properties, recreated the acoustic and visual environment of domestic life, preserving a faint but persistent sense of the house's personality and history. In this late stage, the distinction between actual and perceived presence became increasingly intertwined with the natural processes of decay. The wind whispered through broken windows, as if recalling conversations long past. Timber groaned in response to moisture and gravity, as though acknowledging the weight of history. Dust, light, and shadow interacted continuously, producing forms and rhythms suggestive of human or spectral activity. The house, though silent in the conventional sense, remained communicative, sustaining its legacy of subtle phenomena and retaining its capacity to evoke the uncanny quietly and persistently. Ultimately, the silence of empty houses reveals the continuity of domestic memory through materiality, physics, and perception. Even absent inhabitants, the interplay of wind, rot, and environmental conditions preserved the ambient qualities of past life. The house, shaped by human activity, architectural intent, and environmental forces, continued to narrate its history through sound, shadow, and subtle motion. In these abandoned spaces, the Victorian house's quiet murmurs endured, linking past and present, habitation and emptiness, memory and perception, offering observers a meditation on the persistence of place, presence, and architectural memory. As the final echoes of human activity receded into the passage of decades, the Victorian house remained as both witness and participant in the unfolding of time. Its walls, floors, ceilings, and attics, though increasingly quiet and subject to the slow processes of decay, continued to hold memory within their structure. Each creak of timber, each sigh of settling plaster, and each whisper of air moving through gaps in the construction was not merely a mechanical consequence or a sign of neglect, but part of a subtle, ongoing dialogue with history. These sounds, often interpreted as spectral or uncanny by past generations, were in truth the slow language of time itself, communicated through material, motion, and environmental interaction. Every beam of wood, every lath and plaster wall, and every hollow staircase bore witness to centuries of human activity. They had absorbed the rhythms of daily life, footsteps echoing through corridors, voices resonating in parlors, furniture shifted to accommodate gatherings and solitude alike. In their enduring physicality, these structures encoded patterns of habitation, adaptation, and cultural practice. The architecture of the Victorian home, carefully designed for both beauty and utility, inadvertently captured the intangible aspects of domestic life, memory, attention, and presence. Even as occupants departed and technology evolved, these encoded patterns persisted, creating an enduring narrative accessible to attentive observers. The passage of time itself transformed these structures into repositories of experience. Weathering, decay, and environmental stresses added layers to the house's narrative. A warped floorboard might recall the footsteps of children long gone. A sagging ceiling beam could suggest the weight of years of occupancy. Peeling wallpaper and faded paint told of tastes, habits, and eras now past. Each physical change, whether subtle or pronounced, was both a record and an event, a material manifestation of history in continuous evolution. The The Victorian house, in its silent endurance, remained a storyteller, offering insights not through words but through the persistent dialogue of architecture, light, sound, and shadow. Observers entering these homes, whether in their heyday or in modern times, were drawn into this ongoing narrative. The mind, attuned to patterns, rhythm, and suggestion, interpreted subtle movements, sounds, and visual cues as evidence of life or agency. Yet upon careful reflection, it became evident that the perceived presence was an emergent property of the interaction between human perception and the house's materiality. Floorboards, walls, pipes, and air currents communicated histories of habitation and environmental response, producing experiences that were deeply resonant yet grounded in physical reality. In this sense, the house itself did not haunt, it remembered. This remembrance, while subtle, was persistent. Even in abandoned or decaying conditions, the house continued to transmit its legacy through ambient phenomena. Wind whispering through broken windows, timbers groaning under gradual shifts in humidity and temperature, or faint echoes traveling through long corridors all sustained the impression of continuity. Observers, guided by memory, imagination, and cultural conditioning, experience these phenomena as layered presences, often blending nostalgia, curiosity, and attentiveness. The house's enduring voice was not supernatural, but a gentle, persistent articulation of its history. Furthermore, the sensory richness of these structures provided continuity across generations. Mirrors, polished surfaces, and reflective glass captured light and shadow in ways that echoed past illumination. Attics, stairwells, and hallways conducted sound with predictable yet subtle variation, and furniture, even when long removed, left traces in the form of indentations, marks, and acoustic influence. Every material component contributed to a composite experience in which past and present, activity and stillness, life and memory were intertwined. The house, in effect, served as a bridge between temporalities, allowing each visitor or inhabitant to participate in the slow dialogue of its history. It is in this context that the so-called haunting of Victorian homes can be understood not as a visitation of spirits, but as an intimate encounter with time itself. Creaks, groans, hisses, and whispers are the house's vocabulary, articulating the passage of years, the influence of weather, the persistence of materials, and the traces of human presence. Every subtle vibration, draft, or shadow functions as a phrase or clause in a quiet narrative that spans generations. These phenomena, observed with attentiveness and patience, reveal a world in which architecture, memory, and perception coalesce to produce experiences that are both tangible and deeply resonant. The closing meditation of this journey emphasizes the elegance of subtlety. Time, decay, and material persistence operate slowly, continuously, and imperceptibly, yet their effects are cumulative and profound. The Victorian house, with all its architectural complexity, acoustic richness, and visual texture, exemplifies how ordinary spaces can embody extraordinary memory. Its voice is not loud or insistent. It is gentle, persistent, and nuanced, offering observers an ongoing encounter with history itself. In listening carefully, one perceives not ghosts but the rhythm of past life, the whisper of material memory, and the enduring articulation of architecture through time. Ultimately, the last whisper of the Victorian house is a meditation on presence, perception, and history. The extraordinary sensations once attributed to spectral activity emerge naturally from the interaction of human awareness with structure, light, sound, and decay. Every creak, sigh, and shadow is an expression of continuity, an echo of habitation, and a record of environmental and cultural change. The house, in its silent endurance, teaches that memory is not confined to human recollection alone, but can be embedded, preserved, and communicated through architecture. In listening to these whispers, one connects not with spirits but with the slow, patient, and deeply resonant language of history itself.